Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we dive into the flickering candlelight of ancient chambers, where whispers echo off gilded walls, and not even the royal women are safe. Velvet robes drag across cold stone as queens descend into their final chapters, some voluntary, most less so. These aren't your typical tales of noble farewells. These are creepy, goosebump-inducing death rituals, soaked in incense, superstition, and a very questionable sense of loyalty. Just a heads up, they probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing how far this sleepy little kingdom stretches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins, fittingly, with silence. Picture the stillness of a royal tomb, stone sarcophagus nestled beneath the earth, sealed so tightly that not even time dares enter. Inside lies a queen, dressed not for decay, but for eternity. Her death was no simple passing. No, her body rests there not because she lived gloriously, but because she knew too much. In many ancient empires, queens were more than ornamental figures. They were repositories of secrets. In Mesopotamia and early Egypt, royal women were deeply entwined in court life. They heard confessions from dying kings, witnessed alliances sealed in whispers, and were entrusted with codes, poisons, and names that couldn't reach the ears of the next regime. That kind of knowledge? Dangerous. The solution? Take the secrets with her. It was a grim tradition, especially in ancient Egypt and Sumer, where the concept of a sacred silence existed. A favoured queen or concubine might be entombed alive or shortly after the king's death, sometimes under the guise of honour, joining her beloved in the afterlife. But dig beneath the gilded veneer, and the motive isn't so romantic. She was a liability. Historians still argue whether these entombments were forced or voluntary. Some inscriptions hint at royal women stepping into tombs of their own accord, convinced that eternal union with the pharaoh was the highest spiritual gift. Others suggest something darker, a well-guarded practice where loyalty wasn't requested but expected, sometimes with a little guidance in the form of priestly herbs or a quiet push down the stairwell. Literally. In Ur, modern-day Iraq, the royal tombs unearthed in the 20th century revealed chambers packed with human remains. Servants, guards, and yes, women believed to be queens or high-status consorts. Laid neatly beside the king, their bodies show no signs of struggle, but the strangest part? Musical instruments, drinking cups, even makeup compacts were found with them, as if someone wanted their last moments to feel like a farewell party. A very well-behaved, very permanent one. Here's where it gets eerie. The remains of some of these women carried traces of mercury and opiates, substances known in the ancient world to ease pain or hasten a quiet death. So perhaps they weren't screaming. Perhaps they were dreaming, lulled into silence by the very same hands they once held at court. But there's more. In Egypt, particularly during the Middle Kingdom, priests and royal advisors feared loose ends. If a queen had knowledge of betrayals, assassinations, or divine rituals that were meant to die with the ruler, she was considered a threat. Not to the kingdom, but to the gods. And you never want to upset the gods. Some tombs feature odd architectural quirks, side chambers with tiny air holes, as if the person inside might remain alive a while, or narrow crawl-space-like corridors leading to nowhere. One theory. These were whisper vaults, meant to symbolically trap the queen's voice, so her secrets echoed into eternity but couldn't escape into the mortal realm. A fringe theory, though still whispered among Egyptologists, is that select royal women were mummified with their mouths sewn shut, not for aesthetic reasons, but to silence any secrets that might be spoken in the afterlife. It's poetic and spine-chilling. Because in ancient Egyptian theology, your mouth had to be opened during the funeral rites so you could speak, eat, and breathe in the next world. If they skipped that step, or sealed your lips, you were locked in a mute eternity. And get this, some queens were buried with fake scrolls, deliberate misinformation entombed to throw off tomb raiders or political enemies. Imagine dying not only to keep secrets, but to plant new ones, false ones, just in case someone tried to get clever with your corpse. That's espionage from beyond the grave. Not all cultures killed royal women to preserve secrets, though. Some, like the Persians or early Indian dynasties, simply locked them away in isolation, letting time do the job more slowly. But when kings died young, or when a transition of power looked shaky, the safest bet, at least in the eyes of paranoid advisors, was to ensure no one left behind could say too much. Now, if you're thinking this all sounds a little too tidy, a little too planned, you're not alone. Scholars still debate the true nature of these practices. Were they acts of ritual devotion, twisted expressions of grief, or calculated eliminations masquerading as piety? The answer is likely a messy blend of all three. One particularly haunting case comes from early imperial China, where concubines of deceased emperors were interred in mass graves adjacent to their ruler's mausoleum. But there too they were dressed lavishly, perfumed and positioned as if peacefully asleep. The message was clear. Loyalty to the crown didn't end with death. If anything, it began there. But imagine being that woman, young, maybe 16, told she was now blessed to follow the emperor into the afterlife, offered a cup of warm wine laced with poppy, her last breath taken to protect an empire that barely noticed she lived. Her family likely praised her honour, history forgot her name, and while it's tempting to call these rituals barbaric, remember this: modern states still go to great lengths to control information. We delete emails, redact files, erase footage. The ancients, they just did it with stone slabs and a lot more eyeliner. There's also a strange modern echo of these practices in royal funerals today. Though no queens are being entombed alive anymore, thankfully, high-level secrecy still swirls around the passing of modern monarchs. Codes are used, security protocols triggered, staff sworn to silence. The old fear lingers: when the crown falls, who speaks next? So tonight, as you lie there under your blankets, consider the quiet strength and terrifying burden of those royal women who carried not just jewels and titles, but the weight of forbidden knowledge. And when the time came, they were offered no confession booth, no memoirs, no chance to whisper the truth. Just a silent tomb, and perhaps the hope that history would someday listen. The fire is already lit. It crackles low, hungry, a serpent of orange and gold snaking through scented logs. The widow sits nearby, wrapped in ceremonial fabric, her expression unreadable. Around her, priestesses chant, family members weep, and somewhere, far too close, a funeral pyre waits. Not for her husband, for her. This is the widow's trial by fire, a death ritual as haunting as it is perplexing. In several royal traditions, notably in early South Asia and regions of Southeast Asia, when a king died, his widow was expected to prove her virtue and loyalty in a most dramatic fashion, by climbing atop his funeral pyre and being burned alive. The most infamous version of this practice is known as sati, a Sanskrit word meaning pure or true. It was considered the ultimate act of wifely devotion. Die with your husband, and you would ascend directly to paradise. Refuse, and you might face disgrace, banishment, or worse, accusations of betrayal. After all, if a woman survived her husband, surely she must have harboured some ill will or sinful thought. Right? Of course, scholars today call foul on this logic. Historians still argue whether sati was originally a voluntary act of grief or a coerced spectacle twisted by centuries of patriarchy. Some ancient texts suggest queens flung themselves onto the flames out of overwhelming sorrow. Others imply less poetic motives, like land inheritance, palace politics, or just good old-fashioned misogyny. What's certain is that royal women were the most visible participants. The practice appeared mostly among upper-class Hindus, particularly within the Rajput and Kshatriya warrior castes, where honour, purity and public image were everything. A queen who committed sati elevated her entire family's status. Her ashes were sacred. Monuments would be built in her name, coins minted, songs composed, but only if she burned. Picture this: a procession leading the widow toward the pyre. She's carried in a palanquin draped in white, the colour of mourning. Her wrists are adorned with turmeric-smeared bangles, her hair unbraided, a symbol of detachment from worldly concerns. Children might sing, drums might beat. It was a performance of grief and grandeur, except the final act was terminal. In the city of Chittorgarh, where 3 mass jauhars, a form of collective sati, were recorded, entire harems of royal women walked into the fire when defeat in battle seemed inevitable. Their husbands would ride out to a last suicidal charge. The women, they became flames. Chroniclers, often men writing long after the fact, described these acts with poetic fervour. Like lotus petals in the heat, one wrote, they melted into liberation. But dig past the verse, and you'll find something more unsettling. Some widows were locked in the pyre, others were tied down with silken ropes, gentle restraints, they claimed, as if silk made it sacred. Even creepier, there were sometimes tests before the act. A widow might be asked to hold a red-hot iron rod, walk barefoot across burning coals, or chant prayers non-stop for hours. If she faltered, perhaps the gods didn't want her, but if she passed, she'd earned her place beside her husband, on the logs. One fringe tale from a small Rajput dynasty describes a queen who, moments before being consumed, claimed to see a vision. Her husband, already reborn as a star, smiling down at her. This kind of celestial encouragement was often cited by those urging royal women toward the flames. It wasn't just about death, it was cosmic promotion. But not all were willing. There are records, sparse, suppressed, controversial, of queens refusing sati. One tale speaks of a young empress in the 13th century who fled her palace under the cover of night. She disguised herself as a servant, escaped through a hidden tunnel, and lived out her years in obscurity, teaching poetry in a temple school. A single line of verse remains from her attributed work. Flames only cleanse when they come from truth, not fear. Even more disturbing were cases of posthumous coercion. If a queen died shortly after her king, whether by natural means or, whispers say, poisoned assistance, she might still be sacrificed. Her body would be dressed and placed ceremonially on the pyre beside his. One particularly grim instance in 17th century Mewar recounts a royal widow who had died of illness before her husband's cremation. She was still wrapped in silk, perfumed, and added to the blaze to preserve the narrative of marital unity. And here's where things take a surreal turn. In some royal courts, sati wasn't just expected. It was dramatised. Playwrights and poets wrote stage versions of famous widow burnings. These were performed at court for entertainment. Think about that for a second. Grieving queens reduced to characters, their deaths recited with dramatic flair, as courtiers sipped rosewater and nodded approvingly. A woman's sacrifice turned into dinner theatre. During British colonial rule in India, sati came under intense scrutiny. The British, often hypocritically appalled, used it as moral justification for their presence. They filmed it, documented it, debated it in Parliament. In 1829, Governor-General Lord William Bentinck officially banned the practice, at least on paper. But isolated cases continued, especially among royal families desperate to preserve tradition. Some royal widows tried to outsmart the ritual. There's one quirky tale, possibly exaggerated, of a Maharani who arranged to die in a mock sati, only to escape at night and retire anonymously in a convent-like estate. Whether that's folklore or truth, it reflects the quiet resistance bubbling beneath the flames. Modern historians continue to argue whether sati ever truly died out. While rare today, whispers of symbolic burning still circulate in rural regions. Statues of past sati queens stand proudly in certain villages, and pilgrims leave flowers at the spots where fire once danced. But why did this ritual linger so long among royals? Perhaps because it symbolised total control. A king ruled in life. But if his death could still command obedience from his queen, even obedience unto flames, then his power was eternal. It also protected the throne. A widow could be politically dangerous. She knew alliances, secrets, rival heirs. Removing her under the guise of devotion was neat, clean, and publicly celebrated. Think of it as a medieval PR stunt with very permanent consequences. A particularly chilling moment from 18th century Jaipur involved not one but 3 royal widows committing sati together. They were sisters, all married to the same ruler. When he died, the kingdom celebrated a triple funeral. The queens walked hand in hand into the fire. Witnesses claim they smiled. But the court bard never mentioned how tightly their hands were gripped. Even more mysterious is the ritual's persistence in ghost stories. In certain palaces across Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh, guests still report glimpses of a flame bride, a woman in bridal finery, her veil made of smoke, wandering corridors or appearing in mirrors. She leaves behind the scent of sandalwood and burning silk. Nothing screams unfinished business like a queen sacrificed for politics masquerading as love. In the end, sati was less about grief and more about theatre, a performance of loyalty, a display of control, and a haunting reminder that for centuries a royal woman's most celebrated act was her disappearance. Silk rustles like a whisper. Delicate, shimmering folds wrap around a royal neck, tight enough to press skin, soft enough to seem harmless. But this isn't a gown. It's an execution tool. In several empires, strangulation by silk was considered the most dignified method of executing royal women. No blood, no mess, and no unsightly trauma to disturb the marble solemnity of the palace corridors. Just silence, and the slow embrace of fabric. The Byzantine Empire, in particular, made this method almost ceremonial. When a noble woman or even a disgraced empress was condemned, she might be led into a secluded chamber. There, eunuchs or guards, specially trained for this precise, unspoken job, would use a length of silk cord to end her life. It was quick, clinical, and in the eyes of the court, merciful. Because silk was precious, its use sent a message. We value your rank, even as we erase you. Why silk? Partially because blood was taboo. In many royal cultures, shedding the blood of nobility was considered a cosmic offence. Kings were said to possess sacred lifeblood, royal ichor, divine in some philosophies. To spill it would desecrate the throne. So when a queen fell out of favour, whether for treason, adultery, or simply bad timing, silk was the chosen assassin. Even in imperial China, this practice had eerie echoes. The Han Dynasty had a reputation for balancing cruelty with elegance. A condemned empress or concubine might be handed a length of embroidered silk and expected to carry out the task herself. If she hesitated, palace attendants would do it for her, gently, like tucking in a child for sleep, if the child were a threat to national stability. One famous example, Empress Luji's court, a den of intrigue worthy of its own soap opera. She herself reportedly ordered silk strangulation for her rival's concubines. No public execution. Just a whispered sentence, a quiet room, and silk slipping around a royal throat like a final necklace. It wasn't always fatal in one go. Historical texts suggest that the process could take minutes, a drawn-out tightening ritual with no cries, no alarms. The victim was expected to accept it with poise. After all, wasn't that the point of being royal, dying with grace? Some fringe historians believe these executions were sometimes symbolic. That is, the silk wasn't meant to kill, but to shame. In a few Persian records, queens who displeased the court were richly garlanded with silk nooses, not to strangle them fully, but to mark them as disgraced, a social death sentence, worse than exile. But most of the time, the silk served its full, grim purpose. In the Ottoman Empire, where palace politics were as sharp as scimitars, the strangulation of women in the harem was often conducted using bowstring, a tough, smooth cord not unlike silk, though coarser. Still, when high-ranking women were involved, finer materials were used. The goal was always the same: remove without spectacle, erase without mess. One particularly haunting record from the 16th century describes a young Ottoman sultan, newly crowned, ordering the execution of several of his late father's concubines. They were suspected of plotting against him, or simply represented the old guard. They were quietly summoned, given sweet pastries laced with poppy, and then silk. The guards left their bodies laid gently on silk cushions, as if they'd merely fallen asleep mid-feast. There's something grotesquely polite about this method, as though the court was saying, "We're going to kill you, but we'll do it nicely." And it didn't stop in Asia or Byzantium. Even the French monarchy flirted with similar ideals of bloodless punishment. During the reign of Louis XIV, court etiquette was everything. When one duchess fell out of favour due to scandalous letters she had penned to a foreign prince, she was invited to retire from life. Historians disagree on what happened next, but one theory, whispered in Versailles marble halls, is that she was gently silenced with silk to protect the Sun King's image. Now, it's easy to romanticise these stories, especially in popular fiction. Silk strangulation pops up in novels, operas, even ballet. But there's nothing elegant about slow suffocation, no matter how expensive the fabric. Yet some royal women accepted it as their due. There are stories, possibly apocryphal, of empresses arranging their own executions by silk, choosing the colour, even embroidering it with prayers. One Korean queen, upon realising her political allies had fallen, allegedly requested a crimson silk cord and composed a death haiku before submitting. That's devotion, or resignation, or perhaps just survival strategy, rewritten as poetry. Historians still debate whether these rituals were more merciful than public executions. On one hand, there's privacy, ceremony, and the illusion of control. On the other, it strips the victim of agency, hiding the death away, denying even the spectacle of martyrdom. And let's not forget the symbolism. Silk, in many of these cultures, represented nobility, fertility, femininity. To be strangled with it wasn't just ironic, it was symbolic. The very thing that clothed and adorned royal women was also their end. Silk began as a gift at their coronation and ended as a noose. There's even a curious case from medieval Japan where a noblewoman accused of poisoning her husband requested to be executed with a silk scarf bearing her family crest. Some accounts claim the scarf was later displayed in a temple as both a relic and a warning. Justice with embroidery. And what happened to the silks afterward? Burned, in most cases. They were considered tainted, but a few managed to survive, tucked into royal archives or private collections. A particularly chilling piece now held in a European museum is labelled simply Cord of the Concubine. No name, no story, just a tangle of faded threads that once held breath, now holding silence. But the tradition didn't die quietly. Even in the early 20th century there are rumours, largely unverified, of silk retirements among royal women in exile. Disgraced consorts, former queens who had outlived their usefulness, choosing silk over scandal. Whether true or urban legend, the stories persist. So next time you touch a ribbon or run your fingers along the smooth edge of a silk sleeve, remember, it wasn't always a symbol of luxury. For some royal women, it was the last thing they ever felt. Not cold steel, not roaring crowds, but a whisper of fabric tightening like palace gossip around their neck. Strangulation may be silent, but history remembers the hush. The palace is draped in mourning. Incense coils like lazy dragons through the halls, and the air hangs heavy with perfume and loss. The king is dead. His bride, a beloved princess not yet 20, is lying still in a chamber beside his. Her skin is dusted with gold. Her eyes, closed beneath painted lids, will never open again. The strange part. The wedding was scheduled for next week. This is not a story of a cancelled ceremony. It's the beginning of one, because in the tangled world of dynastic politics, marriage didn't always end with death. Sometimes it started there. Across several ancient and medieval cultures, marrying the dead was a deeply unsettling yet politically crucial practice. And for royal women it was a fate that offered no voice, no choice, and no possibility of protest. The dead princesses were dressed, veiled, and wed to men, living or deceased, to preserve alliances, transfer wealth, or stabilise thrones. It sounds like the plot of a dark fantasy, but these rituals were very real. One of the most chilling versions of this comes from early imperial China, where Mingkhun, or ghost marriage, became a culturally accepted, though still eerie, ritual. The idea was simple. If two people were engaged, but one died before the wedding could take place, the union could proceed in the afterlife. Families would hold the ceremony posthumously, complete with dowries, guests, and offerings. In royal circles, however, this practice morphed into something far more strategic. Imagine a scenario. A crown prince dies suddenly. No heir, no wife. That means no smooth succession, no tidy transfer of influence. So what does the court do? They find a noble woman, preferably one already tied to their political goals, and marry her to his corpse. She becomes a ghost consort, elevated in title, robed in finery, and very much alive, for now. Sometimes the new widow would be allowed to live, taking a vow of chastity and essentially serving as a symbolic figurehead. Other times, more disturbingly, she might be expected to follow her husband into the afterlife. In a few extreme cases, living women were buried beside their dead grooms, either voluntarily, if you believe the records, or under tremendous social and familial pressure. Historians still argue whether these practices were ever legally codified or simply tolerated as custom. The lines between superstition, law, and royal expectation were as blurry as incense smoke. But the result was always the same. Royal women sacrificed at the altar of political convenience, even when their groom had already gone cold. One such tale comes from the Han Dynasty, where a highborn lady named Shuji was wed to the crown prince posthumously. Though her husband had died weeks before, her family viewed the marriage as a tremendous honour. She was led in full bridal attire to his tomb, a symbolic feast was held at the grave, and she lived out her years in the palace, technically a widow, though she had never spoken a word to her husband. Other cultures took this idea even further. In medieval Vietnam and parts of the Khmer Empire, it wasn't uncommon for royal women to be married to spirits, ancestors, or even deities. These divine unions served as both spiritual devotion and political theatre. A princess might be claimed by a dead king, centuries old, thus binding her to a temple or dynasty without ever needing to negotiate with the living. It was a way of keeping powerful women under control. After all, you can't remarry if your spouse is an immortal. But the oddest twist in these ghostly arrangements. Sometimes the marriages were not only arranged posthumously, they were entirely fabricated. A royal woman might be declared a widow to a dead prince she had never met, simply to provide her with a title and position that suited the court's needs. In this sense, death became a tool of social architecture. The corpse was the foundation, the princess, the decorative spire. Take, for example, a fringe story from Tang Dynasty, chronicles involving a princess named Mingfei. She was a minor royal figure with little influence. But after a nobleman's sudden death left a massive fortune with no heirs, the court engineered a marriage between him and the princess, posthumously of course. She gained status. His estate passed into the imperial family and everyone smiled politely over bowls of lotus soup, except, perhaps, the dead man. One particularly eerie element of these rituals is the bridal preparation. In many cases, the princess would undergo the full bridal treatment, scented baths, ceremonial hairstyling, makeup, and an embroidered red veil. She would be walked through the palace as if to a real wedding. But her destination wasn't a temple or bedroom, it was a tomb. Sometimes she'd simply sit beside a shrine. Other times she'd descend into the burial chamber, place offerings on her husband's grave, and remain behind. There are accounts of these ghost brides having lifelike wax or wooden effigies of the groom presented to them during the ceremony. These figures were dressed in royal garb and placed at the head of the wedding table. Afterward, they were either interred with grave goods or stored in ancestral halls. It's unnerving to imagine a newly adorned queen sipping tea beside a mannequin groom, smiling as the court applauded her devotion. Of course, not every royal woman subjected to ghost marriage went quietly. There's a curious tale from Korea's Goryeo period involving a noblewoman named Lady Hwa. Selected to marry a deceased prince, she reportedly staged a dramatic refusal, fainting in the courtyard, tearing her veil, and calling the whole affair an insult to the living. While records show she was ultimately married into a minor branch of the royal family instead, her act of rebellion echoed through the court. It became a whispered example of what could happen if a woman tried to reclaim her future from the dead. And let's not forget the fringe theories, the ones too wild for textbooks but too juicy to ignore. Some folklorists believe that ghost marriages were used to cover up royal scandals. A princess impregnated out of wedlock? Pair her with a dead groom. A political rival's daughter needing neutralization? Marry her to a mummified prince and pack her off to a temple. It's possible that more than a few sacred unions were just elegant ways to silence a threat. In some particularly dark traditions, it wasn't the bride who was alive, it was the groom. Reports exist, especially in early Chinese and Mongolian courts, of young princes being married to deceased princesses. The idea? That the bride would serve as a spiritual guardian, or bring ancestral blessings. But one can't help but wonder what those wedding nights looked like. Ceremonies conducted before incense burners and ancestral portraits, with the smell of preserved sandalwood trailing behind. Even in death, the role of these women was in service, to the court, to the legacy, to the dynasty. They were dressed, paraded, posed, and praised, and then gently forgotten. Yet the ghost brides left traces. In some palaces, sealed rooms have been found containing bridal beds that were never used, veils that were never lifted, and inscriptions naming women who held the title crowned princess, despite no living husband. These shadow queens haunted the margins of court life, silent placeholders in a game they never agreed to play. To modern ears, these rituals sound macabre, unjust, perhaps even unthinkable. But to the royal courts of the past, they were logical, even noble. Love was optional, duty wasn't. So the next time you see a bridal veil in a museum delicately embroidered with gold thread, pause for a moment. It might not have belonged to a blushing bride with dreams of a grand ballroom and laughter-filled nights. It might have been worn by a young woman stepping into silence, a princess married to a corpse, sworn to a love that could never speak back. And in the end, isn't that the creepiest love story of all? The fire doesn't flicker this time. It roars. Towering flames leap into the air like they've been waiting for centuries. Around the base of the pyre, incense floods the space with a sweetness that almost masks the smell of burning sandalwood. But everyone knows what this is. Not a cremation. Not exactly. This is sati, again, but turned up to royal intensity. Among the most haunting death rituals performed on royal women, sati stands as the most infamous, but tonight we go deeper into its elite, dynasty-securing version. For queens, empresses, and high-ranking consorts, sati wasn't just about loyalty. It was about politics, spiritual warfare, and rewriting history in smoke. When a king died, the kingdom teetered. Succession was rarely smooth, especially in the Rajput kingdoms of India or in various Hindu empires. The moment the flame consumed the king's body, questions erupted. Who rules now? Who claims the throne? Who does the queen support? You see the problem, and so sati became a royal solution. Remove the queen from the board entirely. Burn her with her husband, showing the world she supports no rival heir, backs no coup, favours no warlord. The fire ended not just a life, but a political risk. This was not always a choice. In fact, behind the myths of brave, smiling queens walking willingly into the blaze, there are darker whispers, of sedatives slipped into final meals, of pressure from ministers, of temples built not in honour, but in apology. One chilling account from 15th century Muir describes a royal funeral where the queen was led to the pyre by 10 priests and 20 soldiers. Her face was serene, but some observers later noted the faint shivering in her hands. Was it fear, cold, or resistance crushed beneath duty? Historians still argue whether these queens volunteered out of devotion or were swept along by the unstoppable current of expectation. The royal chroniclers always painted them as heroes, devoted wives, shining examples, but those same chroniclers were paid by the throne. Sometimes entire harems followed the king into death. In Mass Satis, dozens of consorts, some no older than 15, were dressed in red wedding garments, anointed with sacred oils, and led in procession to the fire. They circled it, chanted prayers, and then stepped in one by one, often to the beat of ceremonial drums. This was called jauhar, particularly when it happened in wartime, when a fortress was falling, and the women chose fire over capture. Also we're told, take the siege of Chittagong. It happened not once, but 3 times in recorded history. Each time, when it became clear the city would fall, the Rajput queens and their retinues gathered in underground chambers, lit massive pyres and walked into them singing. Outside, their husbands rode into hopeless battle. Inside, the flames rose. It's the stuff of legend and nightmares. But even in peacetime, sati was sometimes staged. There's a case from 1610, during the reign of Emperor Jahangir of the Mughal dynasty. A Hindu noblewoman, married to a Mughal prince, was said to be so grief-stricken at his death that she leapt into the fire before anyone could stop her. But court letters hint that guards were stationed around her chamber. Her family's rise in status after her death suggests something less spontaneous and more encouraged. And then there's the fashion of sati. Yes, fashion. Elite royal sati ceremonies became almost theatrical. The queens were dressed not in funeral black but in bridal red, gold-threaded veils and embroidered slippers. Their hands and feet were painted with intricate henna patterns. Jewellery clinked with every step. They didn't walk into the fire like mourners, they walked like brides, because in this ritual they were brides again, marrying their husband in death. And if the first marriage had been arranged, politically convenient or distant, this was the final sacred union, one that couldn't be broken, not by scandal, not by heirs, not even by memory. Some queens left behind poems. One fragment carved into a palace wall in Rajasthan reads, "His fire is my palace, his ashes my throne. My breath ends where his did, I burn to begin again." That line is both beautiful and horrifying. Occasionally the queen was given a chance to decline. In some court traditions, a priest would ask her 3 times, aloud, in front of witnesses, if she wished to join her husband. If she said no, the ceremony stopped. But, no surprise, very few ever said no. The pressure was immense. The audience, made up of ministers, generals and rival queens, watched with sharp eyes. Refusal was political suicide, even if it spared your life. Even more haunting? The practice of pre-sati isolation. A royal widow would be sequestered for days after her husband's death. No mirrors, no news from the court, just meditative prayers, fasting and preparation. During this period, her only visitors were priestesses, who would guide her spiritually and reinforce the expectation that her duty was to join the flames. In some cases, ghost marriages and sati overlapped. A royal woman might be married posthumously to a dead prince, and then expected to commit sati on his funeral pyre days or even weeks after the wedding. A marriage and a death sentence served together on a gilded platter. And yes, there were temples. Many sites of royal sati became sacred spaces. Shrines were built over the ashes of queens, sometimes just a carved stone footstep or a tree believed to have watched the burning. Pilgrims would visit, pray for fertility, luck or courage. The queens were deified, their flames translated into blessings. But you can't help wondering, were those blessings born of faith or guilt? In the early 1800s, British colonial forces began documenting sati in detail, often sensationalising it for their own ends. Paintings, reports and even public lectures turned these burnings into horror stories, justifying intervention. Eventually they outlawed the practice. The Regulation 17 passed in 1829 banned sati in Bengal, with other regions following. But like all things royal, it didn't vanish overnight. Secret satis were reported into the late 19th century. In rare, rural corners, whispers persisted of royal widows slipping away quietly, disappearing into smoke. And even in modern India, the legacy flickers. In 1987, a woman named Roop Kanwar allegedly committed sati, sparking nationwide protests and renewed legislation. Whether coerced or not, the fact that the ritual could still echo into the late 20th century is chilling, yet many still view the practice with reverence. In some villages, former sati queens are still honoured. Statues wear real jewellery. Young girls are told stories of their bravery. Entire families claim prestige from an ancestor who burned with honour. But buried beneath all the pageantry is a question we still can't answer. How many of these women chose the flames and how many were chosen? A single, bizarre fringe account, never confirmed, tells of a queen who, moments before stepping onto the pyre, reached out and touched the edge of the flame. She recoiled, burned and turned away. The priest announced that the gods had rejected her offering. The ceremony was halted. She was sent to a convent. Her name, lost. But her story survives. So next time you see a flickering candle or a bonfire crackling under the stars, think of those royal women, dressed in gold, eyes dry, faces calm, stepping into fire not for love, but because it was the only path the crown allowed. They didn't always scream. Sometimes the creepiest part is how quiet it was. It starts with a thud. Not a dramatic one, not a scream or a battle cry, just the sound of a stone door sliding shut. Slowly. Finality echoes in the darkness like a second heartbeat. The emperor is dead, laid out in a lacquered coffin wrapped in brocade and surrounded by jade, gold and bronze. But he is not alone. Behind him, concubines kneel, waiting for the door to seal. They have been chosen, not to mourn, but to accompany. This is the royal death ritual of live entombment, one of the most spine-chilling traditions ever performed on royal women. In ancient China, particularly during the Shang, Zhou, and even parts of the Han dynasties, emperors were buried not just with treasure but with people. Royal concubines, handmaidens, even favourite servants were selected to be sealed alive in the tomb alongside their ruler, and once that tomb closed, it stayed closed forever. Historians still debate the full extent of these burials. Archaeological evidence is compelling but uneven. Some tombs contain skeletal remains positioned in eerie order, concubines facing their emperor, hands folded, as though in prayer or frozen anticipation. Others show signs of struggle, broken fingernails, claw marks on stone, twisted bodies away from the main burial chamber. Were they tranquil? Were they drugged? Or were they fighting to their last breath? Fringe scholars argue over how voluntary these deaths were. Royal records often say the women offered themselves in honour, leaping at the chance to serve in the next life. But inscriptions were written by surviving ministers, men with a strong interest in preserving a clean narrative, and the women? They left no testimony. A particularly haunting tomb unearthed near Xi'an in the 20th century revealed a central coffin flanked by 6 smaller ones, all identical in size and shape. Within each rested a female skeleton, adorned in delicate jewellery. Their ages ranged from 15 to 22. Carbon dating confirmed they died at the same time, but there was no trauma to their bones, no sword wounds, no binding marks. One theory suggests they were buried alive with slow-acting poisons, passed off as sleeping wine. Another tomb further north revealed something more sinister. A narrow stone corridor blocked off from the main burial chamber. Inside were the remains of 3 women, huddled together, hands locked. The doorway had been bricked up after they were inside. There were scratches on the wall. This wasn't just about honour. It was about silence, control, eternal loyalty enforced through architecture. The ideology behind these burials was built on the Chinese concept of Ming, the fate or destiny appointed by heaven. If a woman had the honour of being selected as a concubine to an emperor, her fate was no longer her own. In life she served his whims, in death she served his spirit, and the belief held that to be buried with him was to enter paradise with status. Refusing? That was both spiritual betrayal and treason. It wasn't just China either. Similar rituals echoed in ancient Korea and Japan, particularly in early dynastic eras when the line between royalty and divinity blurred. In the Baekje Kingdom of Korea, grave mounds sometimes contained chambers with multiple skeletons placed in carefully orchestrated patterns, as if arranged by choreographers. One royal tomb revealed a queen's sarcophagus surrounded by lesser wives and maidservants, their bodies curled like commas around her final sentence. Even weirder, some tombs included bells. Yes, bells. Tiny bronze or jade bells were tied to the garments of buried concubines, ostensibly to help their spirits navigate the afterlife, or perhaps to ward off evil. But some fringe interpretations suggest the bells were meant to reveal movement, as in, if someone stirred inside the sealed tomb, they would hear it. Whether as a warning, or as a cruel joke, no one knows. One of the most famous live entombment cases involves Lady Li, a concubine of an aging emperor during the Warring States period. When the emperor fell ill, astrologers advised he would need spiritual protection in the afterlife. Lady Li, known for her beauty and serenity, was the prime candidate. Upon his death she was dressed in white, bathed in lotus oil and escorted to his tomb. Legend says she smiled serenely until the final moment, but a private diary of a eunuch, discovered centuries later, suggests she tried to flee before being sedated and returned in chains. The official records call her the Dove of Heaven. The journal calls her the one who screamed. It wasn't always about devotion, though. Sometimes live entombment was a power play. By including royal concubines in a tomb, the court was making a statement. This man was so important, so beloved, that women died to be with him. It amplified his legacy, turned his grave into a monument of sacrifice. And if that sounds horrifying, it should. Because it wasn't just about the dead. It was a message to the living. Your loyalty must be eternal. The tomb was a stage, and the concubines were props, or prisoners. In some cases, the women were given roles to perform even after burial. Inscriptions inside certain tombs assigned duties: comb the hair of the heavenly one, guard the gate of his slumber, sing to him in starlight, as if their souls were expected to continue palace life underground. A macabre continuation of courtly etiquette. One Chinese empress, known only by her honorific Lady of Autumn Light, requested in her will that no women be buried with her husband. She cited the suffering of the innocent and declared it against the balance of the heavens. Her wishes were respected, but her tomb was vandalized repeatedly in the decades following her burial. Whether coincidence or divine backlash, no one knows, but whispers spread that denying the emperor his companions had angered the spirits. As dynasties changed, the practice faded. By the Tang and Song periods, the royal tombs became less populated with live victims and more symbolic. Clay figurines replaced real people, but those figures, sometimes thousands in number, tell their own creepy story. They're called minki, or spirit articles, little statues of servants, dancers, musicians, even concubines, frozen forever in mid-bow or song. Their expressions are uncanny, eerily lifelike. Some have open mouths, suggesting movement. Others wear tiny silk garments, preserved by tomb humidity. The implication: even if you didn't get to die for the Emperor, you could be immortalized as if you had. Yet nothing compares to the reality of actual women sealed in stone. Their voices silenced, their futures bricked over. And here's a disturbing twist. Archaeologists have found signs that in a few rare cases food was left behind in these burial chambers, not symbolic offerings. Real food, meant to sustain the living for days or weeks. Was it a final kindness, or false hope? A fringe theory, unproven but whispered in academic circles, suggests that some tombs were designed with secret escape passages, that a lucky few women, perhaps with the help of bribed eunuchs or rebellious servants, escaped and lived under assumed identities. It's romantic, perhaps wishful thinking. But one unmarked grave outside Luoyang contains the body of a woman dressed in royal silk, with fractured wrists and a crumbling jade comb. No tomb inscription, no family crest, just a body, buried alone. Live entombment is no longer practiced. It has vanished like the dynasties that birthed it. But the tombs remain, carved into hillsides, hidden beneath forests, sealed with the weight of obedience. Inside, the concubines lie as they were placed, their jewellery dulled, their silk robes now dust, and above them, the world has moved on. But sometimes, when a tomb is cracked open by archaeologists, the first thing they hear is a whisper of bells, tiny, rusted things shifting in long-dead silence, as if someone moved, or once tried to. So next time you visit a museum and gaze at a bronze mirror, an ornate hairpin, or a painted clay figure of a court lady, remember, some of those objects weren't made for the living. They were buried in the dark, watched the stone door close, and waited for eternity to begin. In the stillness of a tomb chamber, under the slow curl of cedar incense and torchlight that dances against painted walls, lies a royal woman prepared not only for eternity, but for beauty. Her hair is perfumed and styled into elaborate coils. Her lips, even in death, are stained with red ochre. And nestled beside her wrapped form are tiny bronze spoons, delicate ivory combs, and jars of exotic oils. This is the Egyptian version of a spa day, except it follows death. Because for Egypt's royal women, dying was just the start of an eternal grooming session. In ancient Egypt, the afterlife wasn't some abstract concept. It was a place as real as Thebes or Memphis, a mirror world where the dead lived again, provided they were properly prepared. And for royal women, that meant going into the next world looking like they still ruled this one. The process was long, strange, and occasionally downright creepy. The moment a queen, princess, or high priestess died, the clock began. The body had to be prepared in a very specific way to ensure not just preservation, but aesthetic perfection. This wasn't just about looking good. This was spiritual hygiene. If you arrived in the afterlife looking ragged, you might be mistaken for a servant, or worse, go unrecognised by the gods. So began the beautification process of mummification. First came purification. The body was washed with water from the Nile, scented with lotus extract and sacred resins. Special attention was paid to the hands, feet, and scalp, areas believed to retain the most spiritual residue. Then the real magic began. Brain extraction. Yes, they removed the brain, often through the nostrils using hooked tools. This wasn't out of disrespect. They simply didn't believe the brain mattered. The heart, vital. The mind, optional. Next, the internal organs were removed and stored in canopic jars, each one protected by a god or goddess. For royal women, these jars were often intricately carved, painted with her likeness, and sealed with inscriptions requesting safe passage. But here's the creepy part. Sometimes, the uterus was preserved separately. In later dynasties, there's evidence that a woman's reproductive organs were treated as symbols of royal lineage. After all, through her came heirs. Even in death, her fertility was honoured. But mummification wasn't just biological, it was cosmetic. Priests stuffed the cheeks and lips with linen or resin to plump them. They painted the fingernails, they blackened the eyebrows with kohl, ensuring that even in the tomb she looked regal. One particularly well-preserved mummy of a New Kingdom princess still has traces of rose-coloured pigment on her cheeks, a ghostly blush that's lasted over 3,000 years. And the hair! Oh, the hair! Wigs were common among Egyptian elites, but royal women often wore their own hair, long, carefully curled and treated with beeswax or castor oil. In death, stylists, yes, actual stylists, would ensure the hair was arranged precisely. Some queens were buried with multiple wigs, in case one didn't hold up in the afterlife. Others had tiny golden clips and beads woven into their locks. One fringe theory suggests that certain pharaohs even commissioned death stylists as part of their court, a sort of glam squad for the underworld. Once embalming was complete, the body was wrapped, dozens, sometimes hundreds of layers of linen strips. These weren't just plain cloth. Some were scented, some had spells written on them, some were dyed with saffron or crushed carmine beetle shells to give a hint of colour. Every fold was strategic, every knot sacred. In between layers, priests might slip amulets, tiny charms of lapis lazuli, carnelian, or faience. These weren't random. A scarab on the chest for protection, a jed pillar at the spine for stability, an ankh near the hand for life. But royal women had extras. Some were buried with makeup compacts, others with scent cones, those strange, waxy pyramids often depicted on ancient heads, designed to melt slowly and release fragrance. Yes, even in the tomb, queens were expected to smell divine. And then there was the sarcophagus. A royal woman's coffin wasn't just a container, it was a masterpiece. Carved with her titles, prayers, and spells from the Book of the Dead, it was meant to fool the gods into recognizing her importance. The outer layers were usually gilded, inlaid with semi-precious stones and painted with a serene version of her face. Always serene, always beautiful, never twisted in death. Some sarcophagi even had wigs sculpted into their lids, echoing her earthly appearance. Others featured wings of Isis cradling her like a child. It wasn't just a casket, it was a throne for the journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Now, here's where it gets truly eerie. In some tombs, priests left behind mirrors, not made of glass, but polished silver or obsidian. Not so the queen could see herself, of course. These were believed to help reflect the soul. But some scholars wonder if they had a more symbolic purpose, ensuring that the royal woman remained watchful, even in death. Her gaze, perpetually returning. There are even records of queens buried with letters to Osiris or Hathor, asking for continued favour, promising devotion, or requesting beauty in the afterlife. One letter from a princess buried in Saqqara reads, "May my hair never grey, may my lips stay red, and may I be pleasing in your sight for all of time." Vanity or religious fervour? Hard to say. A particularly strange tidbit comes from the tomb of Queen Tiye, mother of Akhenaten. Among the usual offerings were jars labelled with cosmetics, but the contents weren't all typical makeup. One jar was found to contain crocodile dung, a known ingredient in certain ancient beauty regimens, especially for anti-aging. Yes, they applied crocodile dung to their faces, even in death. If that's not commitment to your skincare, nothing is. But not all these rituals were about honour. Some, as historians now suspect, were more political. During periods of instability, queens were sometimes buried hastily, their beauty preparations skipped or faked. One mummy, believed to be a royal wife of Ramses III, was found with her mouth twisted and eyes open, an undignified pose that suggests her death was violent or rushed. She was later dubbed the Screaming Woman, and theories range from execution to curse victim to political scapegoat. Her wrapping was sloppy, her coffin unfinished, a sharp contrast to the typical elegance reserved for queens. Even more unsettling are the fake funerals. In a few cases, records suggest that royal women who had fallen out of favour, accused of treason, witchcraft or disloyalty, were given ceremonial burials, but their bodies were never found. Instead, tombs were prepared with statues or symbolic items, like a single lock of hair or a sandal. It was a way to erase them physically, but still perform the rituals needed to clean the court spiritually. These phantom burials were almost like exorcisms, beauty and honour without a body. And while many of these tombs have been robbed over millennia, some remain untouched. Deep in the Valley of the Queens, where purple shadows stretch across limestone, archaeologists still uncover chambers sealed for thousands of years. In one, the skeleton of a young queen lay undisturbed, her painted coffin pristine, her necklace still gleaming. She'd been prepared lovingly, every cosmetic step followed. Her afterlife presumably began with grace. But did these beauty rituals work? Did they earn their eternal reward? Or were they simply one more layer of control, wrapping royal women in expectations until even their death became performance? Today we honour their craftsmanship. We marvel at the gold, the jewels, the delicate tools of coal and perfume, but behind the shimmer there's a whisper of eerie silence. Because no matter how beautiful their tombs, these women were alone, encased in stone, adorned in eternity, but silenced forever. So next time you pass a cosmetics counter or see a mirror catching light, remember, in ancient Egypt, those were more than tools of beauty. They were passports to immortality, armour for the soul, and sometimes a golden mask hiding a very human story of control, ritual, and disappearance. A drumbeat pulses low, steady as a heartbeat. The scent of mugwort smoke coils through the air, carrying with it the tang of red chili, crushed garlic, and the faintest trace of blood. Inside a royal Korean pavilion, veiled in silk screens and moonlight, a queen's body lies still. But tonight is not her burial. It is her transition, a shamanic send-off unlike anything else in the ancient world. Among the most captivating and strange death rituals performed on royal women was the Korean gut, a ceremonial rite guided by female shamans known as mudang. And when the deceased was a queen or high-ranking noblewoman, the ritual didn't just aim to guide her spirit to the afterlife, it was meant to negotiate with it. In traditional Korean belief, especially during the Goryeo and early Joseon periods, death was not a hard stop. It was a negotiation. Spirits could linger, wander, or worse, turn restless if not properly appeased, and royal women, burdened with power and often embroiled in palace intrigue, were seen as particularly volatile in death. Their spirits had to be persuaded, calmed, and guided with extraordinary care. Enter the mudang. These were not priests or courtiers, but spiritual freelancers, female shamans who wielded ancient animistic power. They were often outcasts in life, but when someone important died, they were summoned into the palace like sacred fire alarms. For a queen, her gut was a spectacle. Dozens of shamans might participate, each wearing colourful robes, wielding fans, knives, or bells, and dancing for hours to summon the spirit, comfort it, and finally send it off peacefully. The ritual began before burial. First, the queen's favourite possessions were laid out before her. Silk robes, jade combs, hairpins, perhaps letters or poems she had written. A red lacquered table was arranged with offerings, bowls of rice, fish, eggs, fruit, and Makyoli rice wine. In the centre, a raw pig's head stared upward, an unsettling yet essential part of the rite. The pig symbolised earth-bound life, and its presence was meant to help ground the spirit during transition. But the strangest part, the chatting. Yes, literally chatting with the dead. Shamans would attempt to channel the spirit of the royal woman, often mimicking her voice, her mannerisms, and her royal titles. Through this channel, the queen's spirit would speak to her family, confess regrets, issue blessings, or occasionally scold courtiers she disliked. These moments were chillingly theatrical. Imagine a hunched shaman speaking in falsetto, telling a sobbing prince, "My dear son, do not trust your uncle. His hands are red with fox blood." A metaphor? Maybe. A warning? Definitely. This wasn't seen as performance. It was sacred. The Queen's words, even from beyond, could influence court decisions. In some cases, shamans reportedly delivered posthumous decrees, altering inheritances or clearing a name. Historians still argue whether these were genuine spiritual messages or clever political manoeuvres by shamans looking to curry favour. Either way, the court listened. And the drama didn't stop there. Some rituals involved the Queen's garments being passed through fire and then cooled in wine, believed to sever any lingering attachment her spirit had to the material world. Others involved mock weddings, where the Queen's spirit was symbolically married to a celestial figure, usually a mountain god or guardian spirit, ensuring her protection in the next life. But here's where it turns ghostly. In rare cases, the gut would reveal that the Queen's spirit refused to leave. Perhaps she was wronged in life, died under suspicious circumstances, or carried too much resentment. When this happened, the shaman would begin what's called a hyosagut, a spirit negotiation. She'd ask the Queen what she needed: revenge, closure, or perhaps justice. One recorded incident from the 14th century details a ritual for Queen Sinduk, whose early death sparked rumours of poisoning. During her funeral gut, the chief shaman fell into a trance and screamed in a voice unlike her own. "I was silenced by white tea." This line sparked a palace investigation. Though nothing was proven, the incident haunted her rival's court for years. People feared her ghost still watched the palace gates. And yes, ghosts mattered. In Korea's royal worldview, ghosts of the elite didn't just float aimlessly. They could manifest as illness, political unrest, or even natural disasters. A failed harvest? Perhaps a queen's spirit had been dishonoured. A prince's sudden death? Maybe a stepmother's ghost was angry. The dead had power, and the Mudang were the diplomats who kept the peace. But not everyone approved. Confucian scholars, especially during the Joseon dynasty, despised the gut. They saw it as superstition, unfit for the order and formality of a civilized Confucian state. Royal shamans were restricted, rituals hidden or moved to remote temples, yet in private the court still whispered for them. When a queen died unexpectedly, or when dreams began disturbing the palace, it wasn't the priest they called, it was the shaman. The rituals themselves were rich with symbolism. White chickens might be sacrificed, their blood sprinkled on the queen's old garments to bind her soul. Long red ribbons were tied to her coffin and danced by the shamans, symbolizing her passage across the spiritual river, and bells, always bells, rang through the night, each chime thought to cut through the fog of the underworld, guiding her home. Sometimes personal messages were hidden inside her coffin, folded paper wishes, poetry or confessions, a daughter's apology, a sister's goodbye, or in one fringe case a warning, "Watch him with the mole on his cheek," as if death hadn't dulled her political instincts. One tomb in Ganghwa Island, sealed since the early 1600s, revealed a queen buried with not one but 6 shamanic talismans, each hand-painted with symbols, prayers, and protective diagrams. Oddly, 2 of them were for malevolent spirits, not protection from them, but forgiveness for them. This suggests the queen's funeral involved appeasing potential enemies, perhaps spirits of women she had wronged in life. A spiritual apology tour. Some royal gut was so successful, or at least so memorable, that they were turned into legends. One tale, known as the Jade Ribbon Queen, tells of a shaman who guided the spirit of a wrongly accused consort through a blizzard, carrying only a red fan and a ribbon doused in rosemary smoke. The spirit is said to have appeared days later in a palace mirror, smiling. Her name was cleared, her resting place rebuilt. And then there's the question of what happened to the shamans afterward. Many Mudang who performed royal rituals became celebrities of a sort, respected, feared, sometimes even assassinated if their messages displeased powerful families. Others retired to mountains or temples, their voices hoarse from summoning spirits, their hands still trembling with invisible weight. Some historians believe that a few queens themselves became Mudang in secret. After falling out of favour, they renounced court life and took up spiritual practice. It's a fringe theory, but one supported by a few cryptic journal entries and tomb paintings showing women in royal robes holding shamanic drums. If true, it would mean that some of the spirits being summoned in later rituals were speaking through their own kind, royal women who had crossed into the liminal. Today, the gut still exists in Korea, though mostly for commoners, and often viewed through a folkloric lens. But the rituals once performed for queens linger in memory. In rural shrines, you can still find faded silk ribbons tied to pine trees, bells that ring in windless air, and fragments of prayers written in Hangul and Chinese script. Words meant to guide the lost. So next time you hear a bell ring for no reason, or catch the scent of burning garlic and sage in an empty room, think of those queens, powerful in life, even more so in death. Their voices may have been silenced by palace walls, but in the flicker of a shaman's candle, they sang one last time. The blade never drops, the axe never swings, there is no blood, no open wound, no gasp of pain. And yet, the royal woman dies, not dramatically, not even publicly, but with eerie precision, because in certain courts, shedding a drop of royal blood was considered sacrilege. Instead, execution was done through subtlety, shadow, and silence. This is the unsettling tale of the bloodless execution of empresses. In many ancient cultures, particularly in the Byzantine Empire, Imperial China, and the Ottoman court, nobility was believed to possess sacred lifeblood. To spill it was to offend the divine, But when a queen, empress, or powerful consort had to be removed, executioners had to get creative. The result? A collection of death rituals so discreet, so silent, that many victims likely didn't even realise they were being killed until the final breath. Start with the Ottomans. In the depths of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, behind gilded doors and thick velvet drapes lived the harem, a world of intrigue, ambition and brutal politics. The Sultan's consorts wielded real power. They birthed princes, influenced decrees, and orchestrated court alliances. But power breeds enemies. And when an empress fell out of favour, her end was orchestrated with chilling efficiency. Ottoman law forbade shedding the blood of royalty. So, favoured methods included silk strangulation, as we've explored, or poisoning, administered through the most intimate rituals: a cup of rosewater, a sugar-dusted date, a bowl of spiced lamb, and sometimes a massage. Yes, a massage. A particularly bizarre and creepy method involved lethal oils, infused with subtle, slow-acting toxins. Empresses would receive a luxurious full-body massage, only for the poison to seep through their skin. Hours or days later they would begin to fade, pale skin, low breath, and finally death in their bedchamber. No struggle, no wound, just quiet expiration, as if called gently to the next life. In China's Ming dynasty, similar measures were taken. One famous case involves Empress Wang, who had allegedly conspired with her family to place her son on the throne ahead of schedule. She was not publicly tried. Instead, she was given imperial tea, a euphemism for poisoned wine delivered by eunuchs. The ritual was formal. She would bow 3 times, accept the drink in a porcelain cup etched with dragons, and sip. She might even offer a prayer or recite a line of poetry. The poison worked within minutes. Her body was then wrapped in silk and buried that same evening. Official records listing her death as natural complications. It's eerie to imagine. The very rituals designed to comfort and elevate royal women in death were sometimes the method of execution itself. The funeral was already prepared, the mourning garments already woven. All that remained was for the empress to finish the script. Bloodless execution was also a favourite in the Byzantine court, where empresses were often victims of divine correction. One record from the court of Emperor Basil II details the death of an ambitious consort who allegedly tried to poison her stepson. Her punishment? She was sent to a monastery and ordered never to speak again. When she refused to take holy vows, she was offered a cup of wine, fortified with the grace of Theodora. Days later, she died in her sleep. No autopsy, no wounds, just a sudden, holy silence. Some royal women were smothered, not with hands or pillows, but with scented cloths, soaked in sweet oils or laced with sleeping herbs. The act was performed by handmaidens, often ones raised alongside the victim. The familiarity was supposed to soften the moment. It did not. In some cases, victims were convinced to end their lives willingly. This was more common in Japan, especially during the Heian period, where honour was a tool as sharp as any blade. A disgraced royal woman might be told that her suicide would cleanse the family name and elevate her children. She would be provided with ink, a brush, and a silk robe. A final poem was expected. Then she would drink hemlock or bury herself in blankets until the world faded. Historians still debate whether these so-called voluntary deaths were truly free of coercion. After all, when one's entire court whispers about duty and redemption, how much choice remains? One particularly disturbing fringe tale from the Mughal court in India tells of a noblewoman who was ordered to retire from life after being accused of sorcery. Rather than bloodshed, she was sealed into a chamber filled with perfume burners and narcotic incense. The room was locked. 3 days later, when it was opened, she was found lying peacefully beneath a canopy of rose petals. A poetic end, until you remember that no one survives 3 days without air. And the creepiest part? The cover stories. Royal chroniclers were masters of euphemism. No empress was ever executed. Instead, she fell ill, or retired into silence, or was called to the heavens. Entire deaths were rewritten as acts of grace. Tombs were built, statues erected, songs sung about their wisdom and tranquility. But the truth? The truth was whispered behind fans and carved into secret panels in palace walls. A sultan's concubine who slipped down the marble steps. a Byzantine noblewoman who starved after choosing seclusion, an empress whose spirit was too bright for this world. Even their ghosts were sanitized. In Ottoman law, palace ghosts rarely howl or rattle chains. Instead, they appear in mirrors, flashes of veiled faces or a hand reaching out from bath steam. In Chinese ghost stories, the empresses whisper. They rustle silk. They reappear in dreams, delivering cryptic warnings and fading with the dawn, polite, refined, and terrifying. And yes, the fear of their return was very real. Some tombs were sealed with layers of protective symbols, not to keep grave robbers out, but to keep the empress in. Clay guards, stone lions, even specially mixed bricks laced with cinnabar were used to ward off vengeful spirits. One Ming Dynasty tomb contains an inscription scratched into the stone. Not part of the official engraving, but hurried, jagged, almost panicked. It reads, "She died without breath, but not without anger." There's a scholarly debate over who wrote it, a grieving servant, a guilt-stricken eunuch, but its presence suggests that at least some people inside the palace knew what had happened, and feared its consequences. Modern forensic science has begun to catch up. Some royal remains, once thought to have died of natural causes, are now revealing subtle signs of poisoning, abnormal arsenic levels, heavy metals, or plant toxins. The science confirms what legend long suspected. These women didn't just pass away. They were erased, quietly, expertly, and without blood. So next time you read a plaque in a museum that says, "This empress died peacefully in her sleep," raise an eyebrow. Look closer. Read between the silk threads and painted scrolls. Because history was written by survivors, and those survivors had very clean hands. The wind howls across a frozen plain. Snowflakes cling to golden brocade, quickly swallowed by the relentless white. Beneath layers of fur and silk, a princess lies motionless, her body arranged like she's simply sleeping, but her tomb is cold, ancient, and carved into the permafrost. This is no palace. This is a grave of ice. Welcome to the eerie world of royal burials in Siberia, where women of power were dressed in gold, wrapped in magic, and buried in the coldest corners of the earth. Unlike the warmth and ritual fire of Egyptian or Indian burials, the Siberian elite, especially among the Scythians and later the Pazyryk culture, took a more chilling approach. Quite literally. The frozen steppes of southern Siberia became a canvas for some of the strangest, most elaborate and best preserved burial practices in the ancient world, and many of those entombed were royal women. In 1993, a discovery shocked the archaeological world: the Ice Maiden of Ukok. Unearthed in the Altai Mountains, she was a woman of high status, likely a priestess or princess, buried in the 5th century BCE. She was encased in permafrost, perfectly preserved, her skin still bearing the elaborate tattoos of swirling deer, feline predators, and mythic beasts. Her clothing? A high felt headdress nearly 3 feet tall, long patterned wool robes, and golden jewellery. She was buried with 6 horses, meat for the journey to the afterlife, and cannabis. Yes, cannabis. Bundles of it were found inside a wooden container beside her body. Historians theorise it was used for ritual purposes to ease the pain of disease — she suffered from breast cancer — or possibly for her own funeral rite, ensuring her mind drifted into the next world on smoke and dreams. But she was far from alone. Across the Siberian steppe, dozens of similar tombs, called kurgans, have revealed powerful women buried with not just finery but weapons. Swords, daggers, and bows appear alongside combs, mirrors, and perfumes. This has led some historians to argue that these weren't just ceremonial objects. These women may have been warriors, priestesses, or both. The Amazon of the Altai, another mummified royal, was found buried with a battle axe and bronze armour, her fingernails painted and her hair braided into intricate patterns. And here's where things get even creepier. Some of these women were buried in tombs lined with animal bones. Deer, wolves, sometimes birds. One burial chamber had talons strung into a necklace. Another had a cloak made entirely from mouse pelts. Were these ritual objects? Symbols of totemic power? Or signs of a burial cult we still don't understand? One fringe theory, though debated, posits that some of these women were part of a frozen oracle class. Shamans believed to gain visions from cold-induced trance. Their tombs contain odd stone arrangements and spiral motifs etched into the wood, suggesting journeys between worlds. The freezing landscape itself may have been considered a passage between realms. And if you're wondering why they weren't buried in more civilized places, the cold was the point. The permafrost acted as a natural preservation chamber. Royal women in these cultures were not meant to decay. Their bodies needed to remain intact, untouched by rot, unaltered by time. This allowed them to continue influencing the world from beyond, their preserved presence a constant reminder of ancestral power. In some Paseric graves, the women's faces were covered with delicate veils, mesh-like textiles woven from horsehair or gold thread. Not to hide their identity, but to protect it. These veils symbolized the barrier between life and death. Anyone who lifted it risked incurring the wrath of the spirit within, and in an eerie twist, some of these frozen queens were buried not with husbands or lovers, but with other women. Sisters, fellow priestesses, perhaps lovers. The tombs are silent, but the arrangements, hand in hand, face to face, suggest bonds that defied standard hierarchies. One tomb in particular contains two women buried head to head, their braided hair interlocked and fused by time. No inscription, just a single carving above the door, a snowflake etched in lapis. But the most unsettling discovery, some of the tombs appear to have been reopened, not robbed, revisited. In several graves, archaeologists found evidence of ancient tampering. Stones moved, coffins slightly shifted, offerings altered. In some cases, new items had been added: feathers, coins, herbs that weren't native to the region. One theory suggests that generations later, descendants returned to these frozen tombs not to loot, but to consult. These women weren't just buried, they were oracles. Their preserved forms held power, and their tombs became altars. This belief still lingers. In 2012, after the Ice Maiden's body was moved for study, local Altai shamans protested. Violently. They claimed her removal had disrupted the balance of the mountains, causing earthquakes, drought, and illness. Her body was eventually returned to a climate-controlled chamber, but her spirit, according to them, remains restless. Offerings of bread, coins, and incense still appear outside her tomb's location, even though it's sealed behind government protections. There's a reason her discovery stirred such unease. She wasn't just beautifully preserved. She looked alive. Her skin smooth, her limbs unbroken, her expression strangely calm, as if she might wake up, dust off the frost, and step into the snowlight. Other royal tombs have revealed equally strange preservation techniques. One grave near the Mongolian border contained a queen wrapped in birch bark, her body covered in layers of honey. Honey, it turns out, is an exceptional preservative. The woman's skin had a waxy amber glow, her eyes still lidded, her teeth perfectly white. She was buried with bronze mirrors and a single white feather, no heavier than breath. Some of these burial methods defy explanation. One body was found seated upright, legs crossed, hands pressed in a meditative pose. Her body had been treated with some unknown resin that turned her internal organs to stone. Another had copper plates stitched beneath her skin, likely meant to channel divine energy or serve as armour for the underworld. In each case, the message was clear. Death wasn't an end. It was an assignment. These women were expected to keep working, guarding, guiding, watching from the cold. Even now, their presence lingers. Local herders tell stories of seeing a woman in gold riding across the snow just before a storm. Others speak of a song that rises from certain hills, too musical to be wind, too sad to be human. And scientists, for all their data, still step lightly around these graves, their breath fogging the air, tools trembling, because you don't dig lightly in a tomb where the dead still blink beneath frost. So the next time you find yourself in the silence of snowfall, remember those golden queens, frozen in time, draped in power, buried not in fire but in stillness so deep it sings. They wear veils of ice now, but their presence endures, in snowflakes, in shadows, in the cold breath of history itself. It happens just after dawn. The air is still, thick with dew, as if the world is holding its breath. In the Tower of London, guards stand at rigid attention. A scaffold, newly erected, looms in the courtyard. The block sanded smooth, the straw freshly laid. A queen approaches, not in chains, but dressed in grey satin, her face calm. Her hands are gloved, her hair neatly pinned. No screams, no pleading, just silence, and then headless in Tudor England. When it came to executing royal women, the Tudors did not favour subtlety. Unlike the bloodless assassinations of the Ottomans or the shamanic send-offs of the Koreans, England's court preferred finality and steel. Yet even within that brutal clarity there was ritual, chilling, precise, and steeped in symbolism. A royal beheading wasn't just punishment, it was theatre. Take Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, and perhaps the most famous decapitated queen in history. Her trial in 1536 was swift and controversial. Accused of adultery, incest and treason, charges modern historians largely discredit, Anne was sentenced to death. But Henry, in a rare twist of mercy, or guilt, imported an expert French swordsman instead of using the traditional English axe. Why? Because the sword was considered quicker, cleaner and more elegant. A strange term to apply to execution, but in the eyes of the Tudor court, appearance was everything. Anne's execution was rehearsed. Not by her, of course, but by the officials, guards, and even the executioner. He was trained to distract her with a false command so she wouldn't flinch. The famous phrase, "Bring me the sword," was reportedly spoken aloud, not to retrieve it, but as misdirection. While Anne looked away, the blade flashed. She was dead before she knew. But that wasn't the end. Her body was hastily placed in an arrow chest, used for storing military gear, because no coffin had been prepared. She was buried in an unmarked grave within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. It wasn't until centuries later that a marker was added, identifying the spot. Anne's death set a grim precedent. Over the next century, other royal women met similar fates. Lady Jane Grey, crowned queen for just 9 days, was executed at age 16. She had committed no crime, only existed at the wrong time with the wrong lineage. Her execution was so quiet, so solemn that one chronicler wrote, "The only sound was the fall of the blade and the collapse of innocence." Mary, Queen of Scots, suffered an even more dramatic demise. After nearly 2 decades imprisoned by her cousin, Elizabeth I, she was executed for allegedly plotting to overthrow the English crown. But the ceremony was a mess. Dressed in layers of red, symbolising martyrdom, Mary disrobed slowly, revealing a crimson underdress as gasps echoed through the crowd. She forgave her executioner, knelt and placed her head upon the block. But the first blow missed. It struck the back of her head, not the neck. She cried out, not dead yet. The second blow landed but didn't sever. The third finally completed the grim task. As the executioner lifted her head to show the crowd, her wig came off. Her head tumbled from the wig, leaving the executioner holding a bloody clump of hair, while her real head rolled across the scaffold. Even worse, her little Skye Terrier had been hiding in her skirts the whole time, and when her body was removed, the dog refused to leave. It lay beside her corpse, whimpering, soaked in blood. These weren't just killings, they were rituals, complete with choreographed timing and carefully chosen words. Royal executions were announced days in advance, ensuring crowds could gather. Scaffolds were built, banners hung, and clergy assigned to read final prayers. The victims were expected to deliver noble speeches, confess or forgive, and die gracefully. Any deviation, tears, resistance, or screams was seen as unroyal. But there were small rebellions. Anne Boleyn is said to have joked in her final hours, "I have a little neck," a dark, sardonic jab at the absurdity of her situation. Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, allegedly practised placing her head on a block the night before, desperate to make it quick. Her last words were simple: "I die a queen, but would rather have lived the wife of Culpeper." A final, cutting truth. Elizabeth I, in an odd and chilling act of symbolism, kept the ring from her mother Anne's finger hidden in a locket. It was found after her death, attached to a miniature portrait. She may have ascended to the throne by surviving the deadly chess game of Tudor politics, but even she couldn't erase its ghosts. Interestingly, not all royal women died on the scaffold. Some were pardoned, exiled, or mysteriously disappeared. But those who were executed became legends, turned into martyr queens, tragic heroines, or cautionary tales. And it wasn't just England. In France, Queen Marie Antoinette met a similar fate during the French Revolution. Though technically not a Tudor execution, her death was equally theatrical. She was paraded through Paris in a shabby cart, hair cut short to expose her neck, At the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on her executioner's foot and muttered, "Pardon me." Then came the guillotine. Even the guillotine, that humane invention of Enlightenment logic, became a stage for royal blood. Heads dropped into baskets, hair was collected, blood was sponged off the wood. Some spectators kept tokens, handkerchiefs, hair, even pieces of the scaffold, as relics of revolution. Back in England, the last royal woman executed for treason was Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. Aged 67, she was hacked to death by a novice executioner after refusing to kneel. It took 11 strikes. Her execution, by all accounts, was a horror. But even when the blade missed, the Crown didn't forget. The Tower of London, home to so many beheadings, remains a nexus of ghost stories. Tourists claimed to see Anne Boleyn walking the grounds, her head tucked under her arm. Guards report chills near the execution site. Lights flicker, doors slam, and a few say they've heard soft voices practicing farewell speeches in the dark. To this day, memorials to the executed queens are marked not just by plaques, but by flowers left anonymously, ribbons tied in secret, or rings thrown onto graves. Their legacies linger in literature, theatre, film and whisper, and while the block is long gone, the ritual remains, just in different forms. So next time you see a portrait of a queen with her neck exposed, remember, it wasn't always about style. Sometimes it was foreshadowing, because in Tudor England, crowns were heavy, but it was necks that paid the price. The river runs slow tonight, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting starlight in flickering ribbons. There is no storm, no windswept drama, only silence, and then a splash. Something heavy sinks beneath the surface. A boat drifts away, and just like that, another royal woman is gone, swallowed by the waters in a ritual as chilling as it is overlooked. Welcome to the world of dynastic drowning, a strange and sorrowful death rite that claimed more queens and princesses than most realise. Unlike the sharp spectacle of a sword or the distant decay of exile, drowning had a quiet kind of horror. It was secretive, symbolic, and, most disturbingly, clean. There was no blood, no body, often just a name, a rumour, and a very convenient disappearance. In ancient and medieval times, particularly across Southeast Asia, parts of China, and scattered royal African kingdoms, drowning became a favoured method for disposing of royal women who posed political threats. Sometimes it was punishment, sometimes purification, and sometimes it was marriage. Let's begin with the Khmer Empire. Centred in what is now Cambodia, the Khmer court was a complex web of spiritual belief and brutal ambition. When a royal woman, especially a concubine or queen dowager, was suspected of disloyalty, witchcraft or political meddling, her fate was often the lake. Not just any lake, though, one of the sacred berais, man-made reservoirs believed to connect the earthly realm to the divine. It was said that a woman returned to the waters when her spirit was out of harmony with the court. She would be escorted in ceremonial robes to a boat, offered prayers by monks, and then, depending on the source, either pushed overboard with weights sewn into her garments, or slowly submerged by attendants, chanting all the while. Some records say they gave her lotus to hold. Others say they tied stones to her ankles. None mention her screams. Historians still argue whether these acts were truly ritual, or just execution disguised in religion. Royal chronicles, of course, described them as sacred, but the eerie silence surrounding these events, no trial, no tomb, no eulogy, speaks louder. In China, during the Warring States period, a practice known as river cleansing emerged. When a noblewoman had dishonoured her family or been caught in a web of court scandal, she might be sent to the Yellow River for spiritual redemption. The ritual began with a procession, musicians, silk flags, ceremonial wine. The woman would be dressed in white, symbolising purity. At the river's edge she would offer a final bow, and then into the current. One story tells of a princess accused of attempting to poison her half-brother, the crown prince. Her family begged for clemency. The emperor compromised, let the river decide. She was placed in a small boat with only a paddle and a length of red ribbon. If she reached the opposite bank, she would be forgiven. She didn't. Whether the boat was sabotaged or simply overtaken by the current, no one knows. But the story became legend. A cautionary tale told in hushed tones whenever courtly ambition rose too high. And let's not forget the royal African kingdoms. where river sacrifice intersected with spiritual belief and dynastic anxiety. In the ancient kingdom of Benin, for example, when a queen mother was suspected of witchcraft, an accusation that conveniently arose when her son's rule wobbled, she might be given to the river gods. This act was considered noble, a way of transforming her into a protective spirit. But in reality she was drowned, her name struck from palace records. Even more disturbing is the phenomenon of posthumous river weddings. In certain traditions across India and Central Asia, a royal woman who died before marriage could be symbolically wed to a river deity. Her body was adorned in bridal finery, veiled, perfumed, and placed in a small barge made of flowers and reeds. Then, with chanting priests and grieving family, the barge was released onto the river, drifting until it disappeared or capsized. This was meant to bring her peace and ensure fertility for her future reincarnation. But some of these brides weren't fully dead. A fringe cluster of oral histories, largely dismissed by official historians, tell of faint heartbeats and breathing beneath the veils. These were women who had fallen out of favour, or whose marriages had become politically inconvenient. Rather than kill them directly, families allowed the river to take its course. One particularly disturbing tale from 17th century Bengal tells of a princess who tried to escape mid-ceremony, only to be struck down by her brother's guards and placed unconscious on the funeral barge. She drifted for hours. No one retrieved her. The symbolism of drowning runs deep. Water purifies, but it also erases. A royal woman sent into the river left no grave, no legacy, no monument. Her existence became myth, easy to forget, hard to prove. This made it a perfect tool for dynasties that needed to clean the slate, but couldn't afford scandal. In some cases, the drowning was disguised as an accident. In Japan's Heian period, a court lady's sudden fall into a garden pond might be rebranded as tragic clumsiness. She slipped, the records would say. Her robes were too heavy. Never mind that she had voiced dissent days before, or that her servants vanished the same evening. One particularly grim example occurred in the royal court of the Joseon dynasty in Korea. A noblewoman, rumoured to be pregnant with the king's illegitimate child, vanished during a nighttime boat ride. The lake was searched, the boat found adrift, her slipper wedged beneath the seat. Her body was never recovered, but her name was scrubbed from palace records within the week. Historians now believe it was a staged drowning, meant to remove a threat without bloodshed. Even in European history, hints of this practice appear. In the Venetian Republic, one document from the 1500s details the mysterious disappearance of a noblewoman betrothed to a powerful merchant. Her engagement was broken for political reasons, and days later, she fell into a canal during a masked ball. Witnesses said she had been dancing on a barge. The gondolier vanished. Centuries later, divers found a woman's skeleton chained to a piece of granite beneath that same canal, dressed in silk, with coral rings still on her fingers. And then there are the ghost stories. In Thailand, whispers persist of a river bride who appears during monsoon season, draped in sodden wedding silk, her hair floating behind her like seaweed. She's said to cry for her lost dowry, luring men to the water. In Cambodia, monks speak of a lake spirit known as the Queen of Shadows, believed to be the restless soul of a drowned royal. Her temple, hidden in reeds, is visited only at dusk and always with offerings. Even today, some rivers are avoided by locals who claim to see footprints appearing on wet banks, walking toward the water, never away. So why did this ritual persist? Because it solved problems. A queen who couldn't be publicly executed, send her to the water, a marriage that must be undone without dishonour. Let her vanish. A royal scandal too delicate for the gallows. Let the river carry it away. Water doesn't scream, it doesn't judge. And when it closes over a veiled head, it leaves no trace. But that doesn't mean these women are forgotten. In scattered shrines across Asia and Africa, votive offerings still appear. Small boats made of banana leaves, dolls dressed in silk, flowers cast into the current. Symbols of mourning or guilt. Perhaps both. Some believe the spirits of these drowned royals still linger beneath the surface, waiting for justice. Or maybe they've become part of the river itself, flowing silently past the palaces that once discarded them. So the next time you stand at the edge of a still river, and the air feels colder than it should, remember, the water keeps secrets. It remembers the faces of the queens it swallowed. And sometimes, when the moonlight strikes just right, It shows them to you. The wind howls across a frozen plain. Snowflakes cling to golden brocade, quickly swallowed by the relentless white. Beneath layers of fur and silk, a princess lies motionless, her body arranged like she's simply sleeping, but her tomb is cold, ancient and carved into the permafrost. This is no palace. This is a grave of ice. Welcome to the eerie world of royal burials in Siberia, where women of power were dressed in gold, wrapped in magic, and buried in the coldest corners of the earth. Unlike the warmth and ritual fire of Egyptian or Indian burials, the Siberian elite, especially among the Scythians and later the Pazyryk culture, took a more chilling approach, quite literally. The frozen steppes of southern Siberia became a canvas for some of the strangest, most elaborate and best preserved burial practices in the ancient world, and many of those entombed were royal women. In 1993, a discovery shocked the archaeological world: the Ice Maiden of Ukok. Unearthed in the Altai Mountains, she was a woman of high status, likely a priestess or princess, buried in the 5th century BCE. She was encased in permafrost, perfectly preserved, her skin still bearing the elaborate tattoos of swirling deer, feline predators, and mythic beasts. Her clothing, a high felt headdress nearly 3 feet tall, long patterned wool robes, and golden jewellery. She was buried with 6 horses, meat for the journey to the afterlife, and cannabis. Yes, cannabis. Bundles of it were found inside a wooden container beside her body. Historians theorise it was used for ritual purposes, to ease the pain of disease she suffered from breast cancer, or possibly for her own funeral rite, ensuring her mind drifted into the next world on smoke and dreams. But she was far from alone. Across the Siberian steppe, dozens of similar tombs, called kurgans, have revealed powerful women buried with not just finery but weapons. Swords, daggers and bows appear alongside combs, mirrors and perfumes. This has led some historians to argue that these weren't just ceremonial objects. These women may have been warriors, priestesses, or both. The Amazon of the Altai, another mummified royal, was found buried with a battle axe and bronze armour, her fingernails painted and her hair braided into intricate patterns. And here's where things get even creepier. Some of these women were buried in tombs lined with animal bones: deer, wolves, sometimes birds. One burial chamber had talons strung into a necklace. Another had a cloak made entirely from mouse pelts. Were these ritual objects, symbols of totemic power, or signs of a burial cult we still don't understand? One fringe theory, though debated, posits that some of these women were part of a frozen oracle class, shamans believed to gain visions from cold-induced trance. Their tombs contain odd stone arrangements and spiral motifs etched into the wood, suggesting journeys between worlds. The freezing landscape itself may have been considered a passage between realms, and if you're wondering why they weren't buried in more civilized places, the cold was the point. The permafrost acted as a natural preservation chamber. Royal women in these cultures were not meant to decay. Their bodies needed to remain intact, untouched by rot, unaltered by time. This allowed them to continue influencing the world from beyond, their preserved presence a constant reminder of ancestral power. In some Pazyryk graves, the women's faces were covered with delicate veils, mesh-like textiles woven from horsehair or gold thread, not to hide their identity, but to protect it. These veils symbolized the barrier between life and death. Anyone who lifted it risked incurring the wrath of the spirit within, and in an eerie twist, some of these frozen queens were buried not with husbands or lovers, but with other women, sisters, fellow priestesses, perhaps lovers. The tombs are silent, but the arrangements, hand in hand, face to face, suggest bonds that defied standard hierarchies. One tomb, in particular, contains 2 women buried head to head, their braided hair interlocked and fused by time. No inscription, just a single carving above the door, a snowflake etched in lapis. But the most unsettling discovery? Some of the tombs appear to have been reopened, not robbed, revisited. In several graves, archaeologists found evidence of ancient tampering. Stones moved, coffins slightly shifted, offerings altered. In some cases, new items had been added: feathers, coins, herbs that weren't native to the region. One theory suggests that generations later, descendants returned to these frozen tombs not to loot, but to consult. These women weren't just buried, they were oracles. Their preserved forms held power, and their tombs became altars. This belief still lingers. In 2012, after the Ice Maiden's body was moved for study, local Altai shamans protested. Violently. They claimed her removal had disrupted the balance of the mountains, causing earthquakes, drought, and illness. Her body was eventually returned to a climate-controlled chamber, but her spirit, according to them, remains restless. Offerings of bread, coins, and incense still appear outside her tomb's location, even though it's sealed behind government protections. There's a reason her discovery stirred such unease. She wasn't just beautifully preserved. She looked alive. Her skin smooth, her limbs unbroken, her expression strangely calm, as if she might wake up, dust off the frost, and step into the snowlight. Other royal tombs have revealed equally strange preservation techniques. One grave near the Mongolian border contained a queen wrapped in birch bark, her body covered in layers of honey. Honey, it turns out, is an exceptional preservative. The woman's skin had a waxy amber glow, her eyes still lidded, her teeth perfectly white. She was buried with bronze mirrors and a single white feather, no heavier than breath. Some of these burial methods defy explanation. One body was found seated upright, legs crossed, hands pressed in a meditative pose. Her body had been treated with some unknown resin that turned her internal organs to stone. Another had copper plates stitched beneath her skin, likely meant to channel divine energy or serve as armour for the underworld. In each case, the message was clear. Death wasn't an end. It was an assignment. These women were expected to keep working, guarding, guiding, watching from the cold. Even now, their presence lingers. Local herders tell stories of seeing a woman in gold riding across the snow just before a storm. Others speak of a song that rises from certain hills. Too musical to be wind, too sad to be human. And scientists, for all their data, still step lightly around these graves, their breath fogging the air, tools trembling. Because you don't dig lightly in a tomb where the dead still blink beneath frost. So the next time you find yourself in the silence of snowfall, remember those golden queens, frozen in time, draped in power, buried not in fire but in stillness so deep it sings. They wear veils of ice now, but their presence endures, in snowflakes, in shadows, in the cold breath of history itself. A thick veil, once white, now yellowed with age and dust, flutters in a breeze that shouldn't exist. Behind it, a marble tomb rests in silence, unmarked, unadorned, unloved. No name is etched into the stone, no lineage carved in calligraphy, not even a date. In the heart of Morocco, some royal women don't just die, they vanish. Their identities erased, their stories swallowed, their legacies left to rot behind high palace walls. Welcome to the ritual silence of the Moroccan Vale, where queens die in both body and memory. In the history of Moroccan dynasties, particularly under the Saadian and Alawite empires, queens and royal consorts lived lives of paradox, surrounded by luxury, guarded by walls of tile and gold, yet never seen, never spoken of, and often never remembered. In public, their names were forbidden. In death, they were erased completely. The practice wasn't always cruel in intention. It stemmed from Islamic traditions of modesty and privacy, especially within the royal harem. But over centuries it evolved into something more unsettling, a deliberate, institutionalized form of disappearance. Royal Moroccan women, especially queens and high-ranking concubines, were often buried in secret. Their tombs lacked inscriptions. Their funeral rites were held behind closed doors. Even the location of their graves was known only to a few palace attendants or religious caretakers. Sometimes they were interred in private courtyards within the palace. Other times they were transported under cover of night to anonymous corners of imperial cemeteries. There was no public mourning, no official announcement, no weeping procession through the streets. The veil never lifted, not in life, not in death. Historians still debate whether this was an act of spiritual humility or calculated power control. One camp argues that the anonymity protected royal women from political exploitation in the afterlife. No grave to desecrate, no name to curse, no bloodline to attack. Another theory suggests it served as a method of silencing potential influence. A queen remembered could become a queen politicized. A queen forgotten was no threat. One of the most haunting examples of this practice can be found in the ruins of the El Badi Palace in Marrakesh. Once a jewel of North African architecture, its ruins now echo with wind and the occasional cry of nesting storks. Among its subterranean chambers lies a series of unmarked stone niches. No decorations, no doors, just recessed slabs built to hold bodies. Oral tradition says these were the resting places of favoured concubines, never named, sealed forever beneath the floor of the pleasure gardens. What makes this more unsettling is that the male rulers of Morocco were often given elaborate mausoleums, like the Sadian tombs nearby, full of intricate stucco, zellige tilework and poetic inscriptions. The women who bore their children shared their courts and shaped their alliances. Nothing, not even a whisper in marble. This erasure extended to art and records. Royal chronicles would refer to queens only by vague descriptors. The favoured one, the Andalusian, she of the amber eyes. Letters between sultans and foreign courts mention wives in passing, if at all. Even genealogy charts, meticulously drawn for kings and princes, often omit maternal lines beyond noble lady. There is one eerie exception, the tale of Lala Isha, a royal consort in the 18th century who briefly stepped into political power during a succession crisis. For a short time, she acted as regent for her young son. Her name appeared in 2 decrees, and her signature was stamped on royal correspondence. And then, she disappeared. No death date, no funeral, no confirmed grave. Just a final line in one court record. Her voice is now veiled. A phrase so poetic it almost hides the horror. Even today, the royal mausoleum in Rabat, resting place of Kings Hassan II and Mohammed V, makes no mention of their queens. Visitors walk among glittering mosaics, admire the Quranic inscriptions and bow in respect. But no queen's name graces the tomb, and yet, the women's influence was real. Royal Moroccan women wielded soft power through strategic marriages, religious patronage, and sometimes whispered diplomacy. They built schools, funded orphanages, and commissioned prayer books. Some were known as mystics and healers, others as political advisors, confidants to ambassadors, or protectors of court factions. But they left no memoirs, no portraits, no court paintings. While queens in Europe were being immortalised in oil and lace, their Moroccan counterparts were being carefully unrecorded. Even their garments, elaborate kaftans threaded with gold, were passed down or buried with them. Nothing left to preserve identity, and still they haunt. In Fez, stories persist of a lady in white, seen walking the halls of the crumbling Darbatha Palace. She wears no jewellery, speaks no words, but pauses near a wall believed to conceal a hidden tomb. In Meknes, old caretakers speak of a courtyard that should never be swept after sundown. She dislikes it, they say, refusing to name her. One fringe scholar uncovered a series of private letters written by French colonists in the 19th century, referencing a mysterious Queen of the Garden, a royal woman who supposedly lived in isolation behind a walled oasis. She received no visitors except her food-bearer. When she died, her body was buried beneath the pond lilies. The gardener fled the estate the next day. His last diary entry? She never wanted a grave, only silence. So what happens when a queen is erased? Paradoxically, she becomes legend. The unnamed become everyone. The veiled ghost can be any consort, any daughter, any forgotten sovereign. Her anonymity gives her power in a way history never intended. She becomes every woman erased by empire, memory and silence. And in recent years, there has been a slow reckoning. Moroccan historians, many of them women, are now digging through the footnotes of footnotes, trying to piece together the lives of these lost queens. Temple records, prayer books, birth registries, even architecture are being re-examined for hidden traces. A certain colour of tile, a repeated floral motif, a margin note in a scholar's commentary. One researcher recently uncovered a private mausoleum near Taroudant bearing a single Arabic phrase, "She who guarded the Sultan's peace." No name, but the tomb was filled with children's toys, fine fabrics, and a ring bearing the royal seal. Whoever she was, she mattered, but for most, the veil remains. So the next time you walk through a Moroccan courtyard, where jasmine climbs ancient stone and fountains bubble like whispered memories, listen closely. Not for names shouted in triumph, but for those softly spoken behind the veil. Because in the empire of the forgotten, the queens are still there, unnamed, undone, and, in their own quiet way, unforgettable. Chains rattle softly in the dark. The scent of damp stone clings to the air, mingling with incense and the faint aroma of roasted grain from distant palace kitchens. But no warmth reaches this place. Deep beneath a stone cathedral in the Ethiopian highlands, a queen is being laid to rest, not in peace, but in restraint. Her body, dressed in regal silks, is buried standing upright, her ankles shackled to iron loops set into the floor. Her hands cross her chest, not in grace, but in defence. Welcome to the eerie tradition of chained tombs in Ethiopia, where royal women were buried in stone and in silence. The ancient Ethiopian Empire, rooted in both Orthodox Christian ritual and pre-Christian traditions, developed funerary customs that were deeply symbolic and, at times, deeply unsettling. While most royal burials emphasized elevation, release, or ascension to the divine, certain women, especially those deemed politically dangerous or spiritually unstable, were sent into death with physical restraints. Why? Because they weren't trusted to stay dead. In the rugged kingdom of Aksum, and later in the highland courts of Gondar and Lalibela, some queens and noblewomen were interred not simply with pomp and prayer, but with chains bolted to the tomb walls. Iron loops bound their feet. Stone rings fitted their necks. Some even had woven cords binding their fingers, as if to prevent them from casting spells in the afterlife. Historians still debate the origins of this practice. One school ties it to the ancient Cushitic belief that certain spirits could return, particularly those who died with unfulfilled ambition or wrath. Royal women, especially if they had served as regents, ruled during succession crises, or been accused of poisoning or rebellion, were considered high risks for spectral return. So their tombs weren't resting places, they were prisons. A particularly notorious case involves Empress Mentawab, a formidable woman who ruled as regent in the 18th century during her grandson's minority. She commissioned grand buildings, reshaped royal customs, and made powerful enemies. Though she died peacefully, her tomb beneath the Kusquam monastery was fitted with double iron doors and a false chamber to confuse any returning spirit. Even creepier, a second secret burial site, deep beneath the first, was discovered by monks during renovations in the 1950s. Inside was a smaller coffin, chained to a column with no name, just a single carved symbol, the lion, face down. Oral tradition whispers that it belonged to a shadow queen who had once rivaled Mentawab's power and died under mysterious circumstances. The chains, to keep her ambitions buried. But it wasn't just fear of ghosts. Some royal women were buried this way as punishment. Political defeat in Ethiopia often meant posthumous disgrace. A consort who backed the wrong heir or challenged a cleric might be given a dishonourable burial, upright, chained, and without proper blessing. In one chilling case, a queen accused of betraying her husband in battle was entombed standing, facing a wall, her arms chained behind her like a criminal. No priest attended, no incense was burned, and yet the rituals were still elaborate. Even the chained were buried with ceremony. Their tombs might contain scrolls of protective scripture, written in Ge'ez, the sacred language, wrapped in leather pouches and tucked under the arms. Holy oil would still be applied to the forehead. In some cases, family members left offerings, spices, wool, even jars of honey. But these were placed outside the chamber, never within, as if to say, "We honour you, but we fear you more." One queen's tomb, opened in 1874 by European explorers, contained both Christian crosses and ancient pagan symbols, particularly the eye, carved repeatedly along the coffin's edge. Some of the carvings had been scratched away, as if someone had tried to weaken the spell. The woman's bones were found upright, her spine bowed from decades of decay while standing. Even more unsettling, the chains were rusted shut. One fringe theory suggests these burials were meant not only to bind the spirit, but to trap its power. In some Ethiopian traditions, spiritual energy, Bereka, was believed to linger in the body. By chaining a powerful queen, that energy could be harnessed by the state or the church. Her tomb became a kind of spiritual generator. Monks would sometimes pray near the graves, hoping to draw strength without releasing what was within. Others believed these women were buried upright as a form of honour, closer to heaven, always standing watch. But if that's true, why the chains? In the underground churches of Lalibela, carved directly into stone and still active today, There are whispers of locked rooms that were once burial vaults. The priests won't confirm, but occasionally pilgrims hear chanting that doesn't match the liturgy. Low voices in forgotten cadences echoing from beneath the floor. Even more curious is the use of mirrors in some tombs. Not reflective glass, but polished obsidian placed opposite the face of the corpse. Some scholars think this was meant to trick the soul, causing it to reflect back upon itself rather than wandering. One tomb contained 3 mirrors, at the feet, chest and brow. Triple containment, triple denial. And then there's the locked breath technique. In some funerals, the mouth of the deceased was stuffed with cotton soaked in frankincense. This was to seal the breath, ensuring that no final curse or secret escaped into the world. For royal women known to be outspoken, defiant or prophetic, this was seen as critical. Even in death their words were feared. In the royal enclosure of Gondar, a crumbling annex chamber still contains iron rings set into the walls. Guides claim they were for tortures, but older documents describe the room as the chamber of silent women. No names, no markers, just cold loops waiting. And still, these queens endure. In Ethiopian folklore, chained women appear as omens. They are said to guard thresholds in dreams, especially doorways you shouldn't open. One tale describes a monk who dreamed of a chained woman whispering beneath a fig tree. When he ignored her warning, the next day his church collapsed. Tourists sometimes report strange feelings near these unmarked tombs, dizziness, whispers, or the sensation of being watched. Locals shrug and say, "She's just checking your soul." In recent years, Ethiopian scholars and activists have begun re-examining these practices, not to revive them, but to remember. In the National Museum of Ethiopia, a small exhibit now displays replicas of royal chains, alongside paintings of unnamed queens. The message is subtle but powerful. These women were not lost. They were bound. And now, they are being unbound, one story at a time. So the next time you see a statue of a queen, regal and poised, imagine her standing in a tomb, not in peace but in warning. She is watching still, not asleep, not forgotten, just waiting. The streets are silent, draped in ceremonial banners of muted gold and black. A royal carriage rolls slowly toward the palace gates, not with a casket inside, but with a portrait. Behind it walks a procession of priests, musicians, and courtiers. They cry, they sing, they burn incense and scatter petals. But the woman at the centre of this grand display isn't in the coffin, because she isn't dead. Not yet. This is a funeral of power, a performance, a manipulation. Welcome to the eerie phenomenon of fake funerals for real political gain, where royal women's deaths were staged, not to mourn them, but to control those still breathing. In dynasties where the presence of a queen influenced court alliances, religion, and succession, death became a tool. And if she didn't die on schedule, well, sometimes the court just pretended she had. These fake funerals were as extravagant as real ones, complete with rituals, mourning periods, and dramatic declarations of loss. But behind the curtain, the queen lived on, hidden, silenced, or in some cases still pulling strings. One of the earliest examples comes from the Byzantine Empire. In the 9th century, Empress Theodora, known for her fierce religious policies and political savvy, was rumoured to have staged her own funeral after her son Michael III began to consolidate power. Officially, she retired to a convent. But one court document suggests a full funeral was held at the palace chapel, complete with mass, lamentations, and a marble cenotaph. Meanwhile, her actual body was nowhere to be found. Some historians believe Theodora orchestrated the ruse to avoid assassination or to secure her son's unchallenged succession. Her death removed her as a threat, while still allowing her trusted allies to hold influence behind the scenes. Later, when political tides shifted, Theodora was quietly resurrected, emerging as a nun to offer blessings at her son's coronation. In the Mughal court, similar rituals played out. One particularly strange case involves the wife of Prince Khusro Mirza, son of Emperor Jahangir. After Khusro's failed rebellion, his wife was presumed dead by much of the court. A funeral was held, attended by weeping servants and even foreign dignitaries. But British envoy Sir Thomas Roe recorded a curious event weeks later. The same woman, veiled and silent, spotted observing court affairs from a hidden gallery. Her funeral, it turned out, had been staged, possibly to protect her from execution. In China's Tang dynasty, the use of fake funerals took on a spiritual dimension. When a favoured imperial consort named Lady Wei fell into disgrace, Emperor Zhongzong ordered her death by decree. A grand funeral was held in the imperial ancestral temple. She was mourned for 49 days, but according to one eunuch's memoir, she was quietly relocated to a Buddhist nunnery in the countryside, where she lived under an assumed name for years. Her disappearance placated political rivals and religious critics alike. But sometimes the Queen herself had no say. In Morocco, the ritual veiling and erasure of royal women, as we've already seen, occasionally involved the performance of death. A queen or consort who lost favour might be declared dead without ever drawing a final breath. One court record from the Alawite era describes a funeral where no body was present, just a folded robe, a prayer book, and a bowl of rosewater. The woman, historians believe, was actually imprisoned in a remote Casbah, her existence stricken from palace memory by decree. Why go to such lengths? Because a royal woman's life carried weight. Her existence could legitimise a claim, incite rebellion, or influence foreign alliances. But her death, even a fake one, offered political finality. It closed the book, even if the author was still writing from behind a veil. In some cases, the fake funeral served as punishment. A royal woman who betrayed her family, married without consent, or caused scandal might be declared dead to the court. Her portrait draped in black, her name recited in mourning, her chamber sealed. Yet she remained alive, perhaps in a convent, a far-off estate, or locked behind palace walls. It was both social death and warning, stray too far, and the court will kill you, without lifting a sword. One particularly disturbing case comes from the Vietnamese Nguyen dynasty. A royal concubine accused of seducing a prince was given a public funeral complete with music, poetry, and incense. Her family was allowed to mourn, but the body was a painted effigy. She had in reality been sold into exile, her name forbidden from future court records. Her existence was erased so effectively that later generations assumed she had died young. Only a single servant's letter, discovered in a private archive, revealed the truth. The practice of mock funerals also served diplomatic purposes. In the Korean Joseon dynasty, court women who had embarrassed the royal family, particularly through affairs or failed alliances, were sometimes declared dead to avoid scandal. A high-profile case involved a princess who eloped with a minor nobleman. Her father, desperate to preserve the family's reputation, staged a funeral and erected a cenotaph. Years later, her descendants returned in secret to leave flowers at the empty tomb. In some African kingdoms, particularly among the Yoruba, the concept of symbolic death extended into ritual art. If a queen mother was deposed, her spirit figure, a carved wooden sculpture kept in the palace, was ceremonially buried, and her political influence declared ended. But the woman herself often lived on, relocated or confined, her only public presence a ghostly statue left to decay in a shrine. And in Europe, oh, the theatrics were grand. During the height of courtly drama in Spain and Portugal, rumours swirled of queens who died suddenly only to reappear as nuns years later. One Portuguese noblewoman, known only as Dona E.C., was said to have died in childbirth. Her funeral drew crowds, but when a visiting ambassador spotted her in a convent garden a decade later, veiled and tending roses, whispers erupted. Her death had allowed her husband to remarry, gaining a more politically advantageous alliance. Even more curious is the use of effigies. In many royal funerals, life-sized figures stood in place of the corpse, especially when the body was missing, decomposed, or politically inconvenient. But some historians now believe that a few of these effigies were used not because the body was lost, but because it never died. The royal woman simply vanished, and the court chose pageantry over questions. And what about the queens themselves? Some likely consented, using death as escape. Others resisted, their voices silenced behind tapestries and sealed doors, but all shared the same fate, to be remembered, falsely, and forgotten, deliberately. The phenomenon even extended into ghost lore. Fake funerals birthed real hauntings. Spirits of dead queens reportedly appeared not in tombs, but in the very halls they had once walked. In Poland, the White Countess, haunts a staircase never listed in funeral records. In Syria, a veiled woman is said to knock on the mausoleum door meant for her but never opened. Even in modern palaces, there are rooms no one uses, not because they're cursed, but because the person buried there was never buried. So what do these stage deaths tell us? That history is part performance, that power bends truth, that even queens can be erased with a few trumpets, some incense, and a well-written eulogy, and that sometimes the scariest ghosts aren't the ones who died too soon, but the ones who never died at all. So next time you see a grand funeral painting, a cenotaph in a palace garden, or a mournful poem to a forgotten consort, ask yourself, was she really gone, or was she just hidden? The wedding chamber is silent. No music plays, no laughter spills from the hall. The candles flicker low, illuminating embroidered silk, a perfumed bed, and an empty space where a bride should be. Except this bride is already dead. Her gown has been stitched to fit a body that no longer breathes. Her groom, very much alive, or very much dead, depending on the story, is waiting. This is not matrimony. This is a haunting. Welcome to the spectral world of ghost brides and phantom consorts, where royal women were married after death, sometimes to the living, sometimes to the already departed. It might sound like folklore, but posthumous marriage was a real and remarkably widespread custom in various royal traditions across China, Korea, Vietnam, and parts of medieval Europe. And for royal women, it could be both a sacred honour and a chilling sentence. Start with China, where the practice of Minghyun, ghost marriage, flourished for centuries. Rooted in ancestor worship and filial piety, the custom allowed the dead to be paired with a spouse in the afterlife, preserving balance and ensuring the spiritual needs of the family line were met. But among royalty and nobility, it took on more complex and political dimensions. Imagine this. A crown prince dies unexpectedly, unmarried. His family arranges for a noblewoman, perhaps a distant cousin, or the daughter of an allied lord, to be married to him in death. The ritual is performed with full honours. Red silk drapes the room, offerings of roasted pig and tea are placed on lacquered tables, and paper effigies of servants, houses and carriages are burned to accompany the couple into the afterlife. The bride is dressed, veiled, and presented not to a man but to a tablet bearing his name. She bows. She drinks symbolic wine. In some cases, a coffin containing his bones lies beside her as she completes the vows, and when the rites are done, she's declared a widow, alive and already widowed. From that moment forward, she's expected to live in seclusion, wear white, and honour her dead husband as if he were still breathing. Some women embraced this role, particularly if it granted them land, status, or political protection. Others resisted. One particularly grim account from the Qing dynasty tells of a young noblewoman forced into such a marriage at the age of 16. Her groom had died months earlier of smallpox. His body was buried, but the family wanted a symbolic heir. She married the tablet, moved into the ancestral manor, and spent the rest of her life in a wing where no male guests were allowed. Her only companions? 2 eunuchs, a cat, and the servants who changed her incense daily. In Korea's Joseon dynasty, the idea of marrying royal women to spirits carried less political ambition and more spiritual symbolism. When a queen died unmarried or childless, court shamans sometimes staged marriages between her spirit and a phantom consort, a symbolic deity or ancestral prince. These ceremonies were elaborate, combining Confucian ritual with shamanic incantation. A royal medium might act as the voice of the dead bride, accepting the union with poetic verses and then retreating into solemn silence. One haunting example is the tale of Princess Myeongseon, who died young in the 17th century. No official marriage had been arranged before her sudden illness. After her death, court astrologers warned that her spirit wandered unhappily. To appease her, a posthumous husband was selected, a scholar prince who had died as a child. The wedding was held at midnight under a full moon. The groom's name was never revealed. To this day, her tomb bears no companion, yet is always draped in flowers no one claims. Vietnam also practiced similar rituals, particularly among the royal Tran dynasty. Dead princesses were sometimes symbolically married to living generals or courtiers, solidifying loyalty between bloodlines. The living husband would be expected to remain celibate for life. Some did. Others arranged quiet second marriages elsewhere. In one instance, a general kept two homes, one for his living family and one for the memory of his dead bride. The second was more lavishly decorated. What's chilling is how legal these marriages could become. In certain regions of China and Vietnam, ghost marriages were officially recognised in court documents. Dowries were exchanged, land was transferred. In rare cases, the dead bride's family continued receiving royal stipends, as if their daughter were still hosting banquets in the afterlife. And it wasn't always the woman who was dead. Some royal women were married to dead men as a way of securing dynastic continuity. If a powerful prince died before marriage, his family might fear the loss of spiritual legacy. By marrying him to a living woman, they created a bridge, a symbolic womb for future rituals. No actual children, of course, but the presence of a widow gave legitimacy to ancestral offerings and spirit altars. In one rare but deeply eerie case, a royal concubine in the Ming court was married to a dead prince, then forced to adopt a child from a distant cousin. The child was raised as the son of ghosts, meant to fulfill ancestral rites and inherit spiritual authority. The boy, according to court records, was quiet, withdrawn, and obsessed with death. He died before age 10. No one replaced him. Europe had its own flavour of this practice, though cloaked in religious robes. In medieval France, a woman named Yolande of Valois was betrothed to a duke who died on crusade. Rather than annul the engagement, she married his effigy in a chapel ceremony. Her dowry was delivered. She retired to a convent wearing a ring engraved with her late fiancé's crest. The union, though unconsummated, was listed in royal genealogies as legitimate. In Germany, the tale of Kunigunde of Bavaria, a nun who was once promised to a prince who died in battle, sparked a tradition of shadow weddings. Young noblewomen in mourning took vows beside empty beds, then entered convents as brides of silence. These unions were more spiritual than political, but no less haunting. Even stranger are the ghost stories left in the wake of these unions. In China, it's said that ghost brides sometimes appear in dreams, searching for their lost husbands, or scolding living descendants for forgetting anniversary offerings. In Korea, legends speak of phantom consorts who haunt the mountains, their wedding robes fluttering in the mist. And in Vietnam, an old folktale tells of a princess who rises from her coffin every lunar eclipse, searching for the groom who was promised but never arrived. Some tombs reinforce these tales. Archaeologists have uncovered paired burials where only one body lies within. The second coffin is empty, or filled with symbolic items, a gown, a fan, a mirror. These represent the ghost spouse, a permanent companion in form if not in flesh. And even now, the tradition lingers. In rural China and Taiwan, ghost marriages are occasionally arranged for modern reasons, ensuring unmarried spirits don't curse the living. Some families hire matchmakers to find posthumous spouses, arranging ceremonies that blur the line between reverence and fear. Red envelopes are exchanged, tables are set, and somewhere, behind the curtain of this world, a veil is lifted. So what do these spectral weddings say about the royal women at their centre? That even death couldn't free them. Their value, their alliances, their symbolism, all extended into the grave. They were loved, perhaps, revered, maybe, but also used, bound to thrones, ancestors, and shadows they never chose. So next time you hear wedding bells in a story, or see a veil fluttering in the wind with no bride beneath it, consider this. Not every bride walks down the aisle. Some drift, some are carried, and some have already crossed to the other side. The palace is quiet. The throne room, once bustling with courtiers and scribes, now echoes with the soft rustle of silk and the distant toll of a bell. A queen lies in state, her face serene, her hands folded over her chest. Yet, as the final rites commence, a whisper spreads. She has been buried alive. Welcome to the chilling tales of royal women entombed before death, a macabre intersection of politics, superstition, and the perilous nature of power. Throughout history, the line between life and death has often been blurred, especially for royal women whose existence was tightly interwoven with the fate of empires. In some cases, the premature burial of a queen was not a tragic accident, but a calculated move, driven by fear, ambition, or the desire to silence. In ancient China, the practice of live burial, though rare, was not unheard of. Empress Lu Ji of the Han Dynasty, known for her ruthless consolidation of power, reportedly ordered the live burial of her husband's concubine, Lady Chi. Lady Chi was mutilated and thrown into a latrine, left to die in agony, a stark reminder of the lengths to which royal women would go to eliminate rivals. Similarly, in the Joseon dynasty of Korea, court intrigues sometimes led to the premature demise of royal consorts. Queen In-hyeon, the second wife of King Sukjong, was deposed and later reinstated, only to die under mysterious circumstances. While official records cite illness, rumours persisted that she was poisoned and buried before death could claim her naturally. Historians still debate the veracity of these claims, but the fear of being buried alive was a real and present danger for women in the volatile environment of royal courts. In Europe, the phenomenon took on a different hue. During the Middle Ages, the fear of premature burial was widespread, leading to the creation of safety coffins equipped with bells or breathing tubes. However, for royal women, such precautions were rarely afforded. The case of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, is illustrative. After her execution, her remains were hastily interred in an unmarked grave within the Tower of London. Centuries later, during renovations, her supposed remains were exhumed, revealing a body that had been buried in a coffin too small, leading to speculation about the indignities she suffered even in death. In Russia, the fate of royal women during the tumultuous times of succession crises was equally grim. Tsarina Eudoxia Lopukhina, the first wife of Peter the Great, was forcibly confined to a convent and declared dead to the court. Though not physically buried, her symbolic death served to erase her from the political landscape, a fate arguably worse than death itself. These stories, while harrowing, underscore a common theme: the vulnerability of royal women to the machinations of power. Whether through literal burial or symbolic erasure, their lives were often at the mercy of forces beyond their control. As we reflect on these tales, it's essential to remember that behind the grandeur of palaces and the pomp of courts were individuals, women who navigated treacherous waters, often paying the ultimate price. Their stories, though sometimes shrouded in mystery and myth, serve as poignant reminders of the human cost of power. And now the torchlight dims. The palace doors, so grand and gold-edged just hours ago, are shuttered tight. Across the lands we've wandered together. The cold tombs, empty cenotaphs, and moonlit rivers settle back into stillness. The silks are folded, the veils drawn, and every whisper behind the wall has quieted, at least for now. The story is done. But it lingers, doesn't it? All these royal women, enthroned, entombed, erased, whose lives and deaths were shaped not just by crowns, but by silence, superstition, and spectacle. They lived under rules that protected them and trapped them, revered in ceremony and disposed of in shadows. From the Egyptian embalming tables to the Siberian frost, from Moroccan garden tombs to the ghost marriages of East Asia, their fates were never entirely their own. We followed them into the fire, the river, the chain-rattled crypt. We've watched their portraits draped in black, their voices vanish into empty mausoleums. We've seen them honoured, haunted, and again, forgotten. But not by us. Not tonight. Because remembering is its own kind of ritual. Telling their stories is how we pull back the veil. Gently, slowly, without disturbing the stillness too much. So breathe easy now. The candle's almost out. You've wandered through centuries, survived a few curses, and made it back to bed with your soul, mostly, intact. Tomorrow, the world will wake again, bright and loud, and very much alive. But for now, stay right here in the hush between echoes. Let the flicker fade. Let the silence hold you. And if you dream of a veiled queen in gold, don't be afraid. Just bow.